We are all still living in an emergency.
A pandemic speech from the throne.
The reality is nobody knows exactly what's going to happen.
The world has changed, so the Trudeau government will outline a new direction to respond to COVID-19, promising bold and transformative change that could overhaul Canada's social safety net. What's the plan to support Canadians? Is the healthcare system ready for a surge? And what will it all mean for a ballooning deficit? Key questions as the government plans for the long haul.
They campaign on things and they don't actually deliver them.
But will the opposition defeat the Liberals in the short term?
I'm not here for an election. I'm here for the relaunch of our economy.
Join us for live coverage of the 2020 throne speech. Good afternoon and welcome to Throne Speech 2020. I'm Mercedes Stevenson, joining you with our special coverage of today's agenda-setting speech from the throne. We are live right now on globalnews.ca, on the Global TV app, and of course with our viewers on Global BC One. Thank you for tuning in to sit as we listen on this historic day for a very different sort of throne speech. And you can see there, we're just waiting for this all to begin unfolding. Today will not be a traditional throne speech in the sense that it won't just be setting the agenda and tone for the coming parliamentary session. It will go beyond that. It will reveal the Trudeau government strategy to tackle a second wave of COVID-19 and the consequences for both health and the economy from that fallout. We are expecting an almost wartime-like tone to this speech. Only this time, the fight is against a virus. The speech is being delivered to a minority parliament, which means the government must find support from at least some of the opposition in order to stay in power. Today, we are expecting a long speech. It could be as long as 1 hour, 60 minutes. It will address the surge in cases of the novel coronavirus across this country, but it will also deal with the economic and social impact and what the government is going to try to do to support Canadians, what their plan is to help Canadians ride out another wave of COVID-19. Joining me now to talk about all of this from location of the throne speech in the Senate building just across from me in the studio here is our chief political correspondent, David Akin. David, big day today for the government, big day for Canadians.
Yeah, and it's going to look very much like throne speech ceremony that you might have seen before, albeit on a slightly, on pandemic scale, let's call that. So, for example, when the Governor General shows up, there will be a 21-gun salute. We've seen those before, and we wouldn't want to have a speech from the throne without a 21-gun salute. But normally when we have the speech from the throne, it's held in the Senate chamber, and that's just around the corner from me here. Normally all 9 Supreme Court justices, for example, would be in the chamber. In this case, just the Chief Justice will be in the chamber. Normally you'd see every seat in the Senate packed. There's 100 and so odd seats. There won't be this time. Just a quorum of senators, only about 15. And of course there'll be representatives from the government. Governor General Julie Payette will deliver the speech, and at her right hand will be the Prime Minister. I think one of the things we're probably going to be saying at the end of this speech is, okay, but how are you going to do that? Typical for a lot of throne speeches, you end up with a vision statement, but not some specific details about how that's going to come. Those details typically come in budgets. They typically come in legislation that follows the throne speech. And one thing, Mercedes, I think it's important to point out in this particular pandemic year, we are more than 6 months into the fiscal year, and there is still no federal budget. We know there's been lots of spending on COVID, but where's the budget on every sort of what I'll call everyday government spending? Spending on the Department of National Defence, for example, spending on normal economic development measures. The government has not yet tabled a spending or tax plan for the fiscal year we're already halfway through, and presumably if they're going to make some commitments to other spending, parliamentarians before the speech from the throne, they're going to say, table a budget and tell us where this money's coming from and where it's going.
A lot of the pomp and circumstance.
One of the big things that we're looking at today is exactly what kinds of programs we'll have. And remember before this, we were hearing potentially $100 billion in green spending. It sounds like the government may have to back away from that. We were also hearing that there was going to be significant changes to social programs, that the government saw this as an opportunity to sort of revamp the social safety net. But now with numbers spiking across the country, what are we expecting to hear in the speech today?
Yeah, you raised the whole green idea, and it's important to talk about that because you're right. You were hearing this, I was as well. Say 3 weeks ago, a month ago, there was a lot of talk in Cabinet about, not wasting a crisis, really building the green economy, building sustainable business, investing in that. I think you're still going to hear the phrase "build back better." You've heard that from the Prime Minister several times before. You're hearing that from progressive politicians all over North America. So there's definitely going to be that theme, but I think absolutely in the last week or so, we've heard warnings from Dr. Theresa Tam and others that, we have to be worried about the health crisis, and that has to be the number one priority. So, and you set this up well, Mercedes, off the top, the government is going to need support from one political party, and there's two progressive political parties in the House and one Conservative party, obviously the Conservatives. If the government was seeking the support of the Conservatives, well, we heard earlier today Candace Bergen and Gerard Daltel lay out their markers, and among other things, it talks about being responsibly fiscally. So we'd assume then a government might say, we're going to have a blueprint to balancing the budget. I don't think there's going to be anything of the sort here. I think the Trudeau government is absolutely going to be aiming for the support of the New Democrats and the Bloc. And so, yes, to the extent that New Democrats and the Bloc have been looking for attention to progressive priorities, equality, First Nations reconciliation, I think those are the climate change, of course, those are the sorts of things I suspect the government will pay a lot of attention to in the throne speech, knowing they're not going to get the Conservative support on this thing.
Very interesting. Well, David, we will be joining you throughout this special as you are in that prime post there at the Senate as things unfold. But now I want to move to our panelists who are joining us to help guide us through this crucial moment in Canada's fight against the coronavirus. We've assembled some folks who have great insight into how all the different parties work and how Parliament Hill works. Joining us now here in Ottawa is Liberal strategist and Senior Vice President of Government Relations with Proof Strategies, Greg McEachran. From Toronto, Conservative strategist and Vice President of Enterprise, Melissa Lantsman, and also here in Ottawa, NDP strategist and Director of Policy and Communications at PIPSIC is Kiavesh Najafi. I want to start with you, Greg. You're the Liberal. I know you always have your pulse on what's going around in this town and what's expected. It seemed like the government has been shifting gears a bit, very concerned about these coming numbers. How would you describe the tone of what we're likely to hear today?
I think they've got to cover some of the things that David Akin has just talked about. I think you are going to hear building back better. They are at a point in time, we saw the numbers yesterday, as you mentioned, from Dr. Tam, that we may be very much back into a second wave. And so how do you plan through that second wave? I think one of the things you need to do is make sure that Canadians feel safe. I think the first part of the speech is going to be around the pandemic and keeping people safe. And then in terms of, there are some people that have ridden through this and they've been fine, and they can sit back and they can look at things a bit differently. But those people who have been on CERB, they want to know what are the next steps. I think beyond that, we're going to see some ideas around what were problems before that were exacerbated by the pandemic, perhaps homelessness, perhaps our long-term care system. And then I think you're going to see some items around some of the things that we're seeing in Canada, which are very scary in terms of right-wing movements. We're seeing a lot of this in the United States. We're talking addressing racism, the place of our Indigenous people in Canada. I think you're going to see some bold ideas. And for those people who think that the government may be in a point where they're going to start to skimp, I don't think so. I think there's going to be some big, bold ideas that may upset some people. But again, I think there's a lot of Canadians that do not feel that they're beyond this, whether it's from a health perspective or a personal finance perspective.
Oh, I think Greg is frozen there. So just as we continue to discuss what we're expecting today, I do want our viewers to have a look at what I'm just seeing coming in now. You can see what looks like an honor guard arriving there to prepare for the arrival of the Chief of the Defence Staff, as well as the Governor General of Canada, the Commissioner of the RCMP. They will all be coming in. Sort of unique to Ottawa events that we always have this military component, and we will hear the 21-gun salute that David Akin was making reference to. Lots of pomp and circumstance and ceremony around this always. Something that is a vestige of our past, but a reminder of where our democracy came from. There's a reason why the throne speech is in fact delivered in the Senate instead of in the House. We'll get into all that later, some interesting history, but there you can see things starting to unfold today in this pandemic throne speech. The outside part looks similar to past ones. The inside part will look very different. Kiavash, I want to turn to you next. You were tweeting the other day about being in line for hours. You have a small child who needed to be tested for COVID-19. I know there's a lot of frustrated parents out there, and speaking to you today, not only as an NDP strategist, but as a parent, what are you looking for in this throne speech?
Well, I'm looking for what we've been promised. This is a time for real change. This is a government that has promised to deliver real change, and I'm hoping to actually see a blueprint for what this change could look like. Going back to a pre-pandemic normal is not good enough. A time when people didn't have sick leave, so they couldn't, they had to go to work sick. A time when people didn't have access to pharmacare, so they couldn't, and they continue to not have access to pharmacare, which has been promised many times by the Liberals. These are not things that we want to go back to. We want a new normal, a normal that is better. And yeah, I had the personal experience of being in a lineup, starting at 6:20 a.m. and staying there until 11:30 to get a 5-second test. The staff were incredibly professional and helpful. But the fact is that we're lacking the capacity to meet the demands of this pandemic. One thing that you and David have made very clear is that speeches from the throne are just words. They give us a guidance to where the government is going, but they're not solid action. And we're going to have to wait to see and judge this government by its actions, not by its words. To give you one example, last speech from the throne promised pharmacare. We don't have it. It promised universal dental care. We don't have it. It promised tax cuts. It did deliver those. So, it's always about what they say and what are the markers they put. And then it's the job of Parliament to really make sure that the government is held to account and actually delivers on the needs of Canadians.
Well, and when you look at what you're expecting, I mean, we know the Conservatives are already saying they're not going to be supporting this, Melissa. Is that a little bit premature when you haven't heard the speech yet?
Look, I think directionally over the last couple of weeks, you've heard them put out a whole bunch of trial balloons saying that this is going to be an ambitious change to the agenda. So perhaps that is predicated on what they've already signaled about the throne speech. But look, this is a big opportunity for a government. I think that everybody is willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think if the speech was written a couple weeks ago, I think it would be much more focused on economic recovery. And in the last 10 days, our COVID numbers, our positive test cases, our long lineups for testing, our inability to meet those testing lines with lab capacity, long-term care. All of these are centered around the pandemic response. So I suspect that much of the speech will be around what we're going to see them do now. But the expectations really high. They've had 6 to 8 months with this pandemic. They had the Prime Minister out every single day. So whatever is in that speech better be different than what we've been hearing for the last 6 months, because it feels a lot like we're at square one here, Mercedes.
Greg, how much do you think they've had to shift the speech from their initial intentions? Are we still going to see this really bold policy change that they promised, or do they have to kind of put some water in their wine when they're dealing with a situation that is explosive? I mean, one government source said to me that they see this as really being Canada at a crossroads, not just in terms of the social programs, but right now they're seeing it as Canada at a crossroads when it comes to the pandemic numbers. There's a possibility that we could have to go into another lockdown. Those are provincial lockdowns, not federal, but that could be coming back. And so they're having to adjust appropriately. The fact that we have the Prime Minister making a public address later tonight, something that is highly unusual, especially right after a throne speech. What does all of that tell you?
I think we can look at Parliament as a mirror for our country right now. We have two party leaders, the leader of the Conservatives, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, who are in self-isolation. Sadly as well, Erin O'Toole's spouse has been diagnosed with COVID-19. Think about where we were at the start of this. The Prime Minister was self-isolating. His wife was diagnosed with it. So in some ways, to answer your question about the last 10 days, the last 10 days look a lot like the beginning of the pandemic. And I think no government can operate in a vacuum. I think obviously This impacts and brings it quite home for all parliamentarians. Last June, the Conservative House Leader was talking about that we could see all 338 MPs vote through social distancing. Last week, Karen Vecchio, as the new deputy leader, was, moving quite far away from that for obvious reasons. So, here we are, 6 months into this or more, and we look a lot like we did, at the beginning. And I think that's probably disappointing to a lot of the people that thought we would no longer be talking about flattening the curve at this point.
Okay, well, we're going to put this panel on pause for just a moment. We're going to come back to you, but we want to get some regional perspective, because one of the things that the speech from the throat has to do is address pan-Canadian issues. And there have been provinces that have been particularly hard hit when it comes to COVID, as well as to the economic fallout. One of those provinces is Alberta, which has been suffering tremendously from the fall in oil prices. We have Natalie Pond joining us from Alberta, so we're going to go to Natalie now. Natalie, what is Alberta looking for in this speech?
I think the main thing is going to be economic recovery, similar to things Albertans have been saying for a number of years now under the leadership of the Trudeau Liberals. We're still continuing to struggle with low oil prices and low revenues here in Alberta. People are unemployed. People don't have job security or jobs paying at the levels that they're used to in the past few years. And that's the major concern here. In the last few years, we have seen that Liberals show quite a disdain to the oil industry, to people that work in the oil sands, and in general to the needs of Albertans. And so I think what we're going to be looking for is more of a national unity message, but also that Ottawa is paying attention to the needs of the people out west.
Natalie, what's your sense of where the separatist sentiment is in Alberta right now?
I think it's still kind of simmering, and it's going to be one of those things that if we're not careful, it is going to explode any day now. I think that there always has been some separatist sympathies out here in Alberta, but we really should be worried when fairly successful, normal people, especially in Edmonton and Calgary, start to take this movement a little bit more seriously, and it's not just, being brushed off as some extremist quacks that are really not representative of the rest of the community. I talked to really normal, successful people in Calgary and Edmonton who are now starting to say that separatism is more and more appealing every day to them, and that's what should be alarming to not only the rest of us in Alberta, but Canadians as a whole.
We also have Omar Khan joining us. He's a Liberal strategist and he works with Hill and Knowlton. My apologies, Omar. We're having some technical issues here. Just trying to get everyone. We've got you all on the same panel now. You're a Liberal strategist. You're in the GTA. That is such a key area that the Liberal government has to maintain their support in. They've just called 2 by-elections there. What's your sense of what people around the GTA are really going to be looking for and expecting out of this speech?
Well, a couple of things. So first of all, I think it's important to point out that the GTA is the most, if not one of the most, if not the most diverse geographic locations within the country. Within the city of Toronto, I think 57% of the population of the city were born outside of the country, and that doesn't include someone like me, who is a person of color but was still born in the country. We know that a lot of the effects of this economic downturn associated with COVID-19 have disproportionately impacted both women, but also persons of color, and particularly persons of color working in the service sector. We also know that within the Greater Toronto Area, we've had a disproportionate impact in terms of infection rates amongst persons of color and racialized Canadians. So I think Ontarians, and in particular those in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, will be looking to the speech today to see what will the government be doing right now to address the immediate fire that is burning in our house, right? So we have a public health and economic fire that has been burning for some months. It died down a little bit and now it's firing up again. So what resources are being put towards that fight? And then moving forward, once the fire has been contained, as we start to look towards rebuilding our house, what will the government be putting forward and how are they going to pay for it? What fiscal rails will we put around some of these new structural measures that will be intended to address some of the economic and social disparity that existed pre-COVID, but has now been exacerbated by COVID. I think a lot of folks in my neck of the woods will be looking for that.
Absolutely, and whether there will be any, because while Canadians have welcomed some of the spending, and certainly CERB has been critical for some folks, the discussion of abandoning fiscal anchors certainly had a number of people in the finance department nervous. We'll come back to you both, Natalie and Omar, in just a few moments. But for now, for our viewers, one of the questions we wanted to address today in this broadcast is, what is the speech from the throne? Because we talk about it, and Ottawa insiders and political nerds like me always enjoy digging in, but it sounds like an odd name, and it's not always clear what the purpose is. So we put together a little package to walk you through exactly what the speech from the throne is and what its origins are. Check this out. 3 raps on the door of the House of Commons by the Usher of the Black Rod. It's the signal for members of Parliament that it's time to head to the Senate for the speech from the throne. The throne speech marks the beginning of a new session of Parliament, either after an election or prorogation, laying out the government's priorities and agenda. But it is read by the Governor General, not the Prime Minister. The pomp and traditions around the speech are steeped in the history of parliamentary democracy. For example, MPs stand behind a boundary line in the Senate chamber as a symbol of the independence between the Senate and the House.
It has to take place in the Senate chamber because the Crown, as represented by the Governor General, can't enter the House of Commons. So that dates back many centuries when the Crown would try and intimidate the House of Commons and come in with its soldiers and arrest its members.
Once the priorities are read, it's up to MPs and parties to decide if they agree with the government's plans for the next session. The opposition is typically given a chance to respond to the throne speech with their own reply, a chance to critique the government and suggest amendments.
That doesn't have to happen, and it may be that the government chooses to hold the throne speech and then immediately proceed with financial measures with respect to the pandemic, and those financial measures would count as a vote of confidence anyway.
Back in August, the Liberals prorogued Parliament, stopping all parliamentary business, done in the name of COVID-19, as the Liberals plan to hit the reset button to deal with the global pandemic. It's not just the contents of the speech that will have a pandemic focus. Even the way it's presented will look different.
Typically when we have a throne speech, right, we see this kind of full Senate chamber with tons of people and everybody's there all decked out. I expect that we're going to see something far more moderate and far more dressed down, probably far fewer people, quite a few people probably wearing masks, and it's going to be formally, obviously, an important occasion, but in terms of the visuals that we're going to see, I suspect it's going to look like a pretty empty chamber, all things considered.
Top of mind for the government, a potential second wave of COVID-19 and supporting Canadians financially. In 2019, the government laid out 5 key priorities: fighting climate change, strengthening the middle class, walking the road of reconciliation, keeping Canadians safe and healthy, and positioning Canada for success in an uncertain world. Those priorities have largely been knocked off the agenda by the pandemic. And of course, that pandemic, the center of today's throne speech as the government prepares. You're looking at footage right now of the inside of the Senate chamber, where you have senators milling around. A few moments ago, the bells began ringing. Those bells summon senators to come in and take their seats for the speech from the throne, which, as you just heard, is always delivered by the Governor General of Canada, Julie Payette. And Julie Payette herself has been under fire lately. Investigations into alleged workplace harassment at Rideau Hall by the Governor General. So a bit of an interesting day for her to be stepping up to read this speech. We are expecting the speech to be as much as an hour long, focused primarily on COVID-19 and both the health and economic fallout. You will not see a lot of detail today. The throne speech is about setting tone and direction. So don't expect to necessarily see the numbers like you would in a budget, but we'll get a sense of where the government is going. And I can tell you that this is a speech that Liberal sources have said has been a tremendous number of consultations and changes. The initial intention going into this, as Prime Minister Trudeau had announced, was to reset the agenda, because when the government won a minority last year and they came in with the speech from the throne, the intention was to do the things we just laid out for you in that package. They had their priorities. Well, COVID-19 has blown everyone's plans out of the water, including the government's. They had wanted to use this opportunity to reset the social agenda for Canada. They used words like bold, transformative change. There There are questions about how much of that will actually make it into the speech as the government has to change gears into the crisis mode again. Government sources telling me that they are worried that if something is not done, if the infection rate does not slow down within the next 2 weeks or so, that we could be looking at lockdowns again. We could be looking at a situation that is as bad or worse as March or April were. So that has forced the government to turn their attention to dealing with the more immediate issues around the pandemic. For example, the CERB, that emergency response benefit that many Canadians received after they lost their jobs as a result of COVID-19. Will the government be introducing another version of that because it's expired? Certainly indicates to us at this point, we heard from Dominic LeBlanc on the West Block this previous Sunday that they were expecting to replace that somehow. What supports will be there to try to keep businesses in business when they are facing a situation where they can't do business as normal and they could be having to face shutdowns that will affect their ability to attract customers? What will they do in terms of healthcare? The provinces want more money. Just on Friday, we had 4 premiers here in Ottawa throwing themselves at the mercy of the federal government, asking for billions, about $70 billion more in health spending, not just to deal with COVID-19, but all the follow-on effects that has created in the healthcare system. Delayed surgeries, delayed diagnosis, people who are waiting to find out whether or not they have cancer. All those issues there today. One of the big questions is about childcare. I want to bring in our panel of strategists now. This recession has been termed by some economists a she session because it is affecting women disproportionately, particularly lower income women, and they're finding a challenge with getting back into the workforce or even being able to stay in the workforce because not only are they trying to juggle their jobs, but now childcare and kids who are sometimes e-learning from home. If your child has the sniffles, they can't go to daycare, they can't go to school for 2 weeks, you have to take them for a COVID test, and as Kiavash found out firsthand, wait in line for maybe 8 hours hoping that you get in. Melissa, do you think that this is a good time for the government to introduce some kind of a childcare plan?
There literally is no Liberal government in history that hasn't talked about a childcare. So the expectation is there for them to outline some kind of plan, because what you said is absolutely true. I think that women in this country have overwhelmingly felt this. They continue to feel this as school goes back and there's a bit of a hiccup in the restart on school, as daycares that existed may not exist anymore from a financial perspective. This puts a huge burden on them. I suspect that they'll talk about childcare in a way that they have before. But I will give them the benefit of the doubt. But we've never seen a Liberal government act on it in the past.
Kiavash, the NDP wanted pharmacare. It was promised in the last throne speech. It hasn't materialized. If it's not in this one, would that be a deal killer for the NDP? Are you willing to say, look, we promised this. It's so important in light of the pandemic. If it's not there, we're going to the polls, despite the fact that would mean an election during a pandemic?
I think Jagmeet Singh has been very careful to set a series of ideas in front of the government to support Canadians through this crisis. This is not a time for playing chicken with government over their speech from the throne, and I think the focus is going to have to be on actual deliverables closer to budget time. But I just want to go back to the childcare question that you asked. What we've seen happening to a generation of women in the workforce is atrocious. We have wiped off 50 years of progress in increasing the number of women in the workforce. And this is going to have, for this generation of women, it is going to have lifetime impact in their income and their retirement savings. So addressing childcare is essential. And as Melissa said, 20 years, every single year, we've been promised by the Liberals childcare. And if in the past 20 years, Liberals and Conservatives had put ordinary Canadians first as opposed to their well-established friends, probably today we would have childcare centers and the impact of the pandemic would not be so terrible on women's careers. And this is why I say that this is an opportunity for real change we have been promised by the government. And it's a real opportunity to make sure that, the next pandemic or the second and third wave of this pandemic do not ruin more jobs and more livelihoods.
I'm just going to pause our panel there for a moment because we need to check back in with our David Akin, who's in the Senate building, before we lose his feed, as we are expecting the throne speech to start to really unfold where you are. David, we discussed that you covered Dr. Tam's press conference yesterday. Explain what the reaction has been to her fairly stark message about where Canada is heading when it comes to COVID-19.
Yeah, sure. Just to let you know, I do have to be quiet when the vice-regal party goes by me, right behind me. That's one of the protocols around here. So I'll zip it if you see the GG. Shouldn't be here, though, for a few more minutes. As far as Dr. Tam goes, you're quite right. Yesterday, she released the latest modeling from the Public Health Agency of Canada. It's based on data collected by provincial authorities. And she did use a phrase that said, Canada is at a crossroads. It got everybody's attention. Watch this.
My message today is the time is now. We're at a bit of a crossroads.
A crossroads, Canada's top public health official says, a choice between continuing with schools and businesses reopening or a potential return to the lockdowns of the spring.
It's not surprising to have increasing cases in the fall. We've actually said this can happen. But now you gotta just keep things under control without the full lockdown.
Dr. Theresa Tam said this unsurprising new wave of infections, the second wave, is different from the first wave.
This surge is a very different surge to the previous wave. It is younger people. Right now we're seeing that the mortality is lower. The hospitalizations are lower.
But that could quickly change.
It's going to spill over into high-risk populations.
Hence, a call by Canada's health minister to show more self-restraint.
We have to get better at saying no more than yes to the invitations that we're receiving to gather for barbecues in the backyard or parties to celebrate occasions.
Another key difference this time, much higher testing capacity and more knowledge about tracing and breaking the transmission chain. Those factors may help smooth the transmission curve into some lower peaks and valleys.
We want to keep it at low moguls. We don't want it to go up a giant ski hill and down again.
And to keep the rate of transmission at what Tam called a slow burn, she said it's crucial Canadians do their part. Wash hands frequently, maintain physical distance, wear a mask when distancing is difficult, and stay home if experiencing any symptoms, even mild ones. And local public health authorities have to do their part too, with beefed up testing capacity, robust tracing, and resources to respond to outbreaks. Now, what's the federal government's role in all this? That, of course, is going to be one of the subjects du jour here. And, of course, all through this, ever since the spring, the federal government has supported decisions by local and provincial health authorities. It's, as you mentioned, Mercedes, it's been provinces who have brought in lockdowns. And right now around the country, we're seeing different hotspots. Here in Ottawa, for example, the chief public health officer is very concerned. We saw the highest number of daily cases in Ottawa that we've seen in months. We know that Ontario has brought down the number of people who can be together. Same thing in BC. But here's one thing Tam also noted yesterday. She said west of Atlantic Canada is where the concern is right now. And what's going on in Atlantic Canada? There's a bubble. All the provincial health authorities there said Atlantic Canada's in a bubble. You go in there, you got to quarantine for 14 days, and they seem to have some control. But again, that was a decision made by provincial authorities. And so on the throne speech in a few minutes, presumably you're going to hear the federal government talk about continuing to support the role of local officials to do what they think is best. And again, no one wants a lockdown. No one wants to shut schools down again. That's why everybody's got to be smart about these things. Mercedes?
David, we've been hearing that there's sort of three big planks to this speech. The immediate emergency response that the government thinks we're still into COVID-19, supports for the economy and for Canadians that will be more social and economic, and then the rebuilding aspect. Walk us through what you're expecting in those three segments.
Well, on the rebuilding aspect, there's really two parts of it. There is the business economy, and presumably the government is going to speak to businesses that have been slowly but surely turning themselves on, but it's very hit and miss by sector. We may need some sectoral support, and the government may want to speak to that. But just as important is going to be continued support for Canadian families, Canadian individuals. I don't need to remind anybody, but the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, it ends this weekend. Now, there's still about 4 million people on the CERB. 3 million of those are going to transition to a new EI program, a simplified employment insurance program. That's already in the works. That's been organized through cabinet order, cabinet regulation. But there's 1 million people on the CERB right now who won't qualify for EI. Those are self-employed and others. There needs to be some benefit programs for them. And the government has already announced what they want to do with that. They do have some benefit programs in place, but that requires legislation. And that means people in the House of Commons have got to vote on these things. So one of the interesting things today, and I guess probably in the House of Commons business that follows it, what comes first? Do you want to have debate on speech from the throne? Or do you want to get right to it to look for new benefits, emergency benefits, to support those whose emergency benefits run out at the end of the week? So again, those are the two things. Look for what is the government doing to replace the CERB and transition to new benefit supports, and what is the government proposing to do to continue to push businesses forward.
And we are just waiting right now, David, just outside your building for the Prime Minister to arrive. We'll bring that to our viewers as it happens. But just across the street, you see the iconic Chateau Laurier. And that is where the 4 premiers were last week, asking for $70 billion more in health care from the federal government. Take a listen to what Premier Jason Kenney of Alberta said his reason was for coming to Ottawa to make this ask.
We started to hear these trial balloons from Ottawa in the last 2 or 3 weeks about all sorts of ideological shiny objects about spending money on things not related to healthcare or jobs. And we're here to say that Canadians want governments at all levels and all parties to be focused on protecting both lives and livelihoods. If there are parties or governments that want to pursue their ideological concerns at some point in the future, they can do that and be accountable to the voters. But in this COVID year, in the largest economic contraction in 9 decades, surely we can all agree that we should be single-mindedly focused on the public health urgency and the economic crisis that's in front of us. That's the message being sent by Canada's premiers today.
Responding to that, we have Natalie Pon, who is, of course, out in Alberta, and Omar Khan, who is in Toronto. Natalie is a conservative. Omar is a liberal. Natalie, it kind of seemed like the government thought these premiers might be playing a political game. They questioned why, if their provinces are struggling so much right now with testing, wait times and outbreaks, they would fly to Ottawa to present this. What were your thoughts on the premier's asks, and do you think we'll see it in the throne speech?
I think the premier is doing exactly what his job is, and that's representing the needs of Albertans out here. And in order to do so, he did need to deliver that message. One thing that I think is sometimes maybe lost on politicians that normal everyday people are thinking about is we need to, quote unquote, reopen the economy. I don't think anyone is actually saying, this isn't actually a public health crisis. This isn't a real disease or pandemic, but we somehow need to balance reopening the economy, making sure businesses can operate and keep people employed while at the same time keeping us all safe. And I think the interpretation I get out here in Alberta is that governments seem to be focused more so on the public health aspect side, and they just think that the economy can just be thrown to the wayside. And I think that's the message that the Premier is trying to communicate to the Prime Minister and to the federal government right now, is what are you also doing for the economy right now? It's great that there are going to be, expanded EI and other aid measures for people that are out of work right now, but that isn't quite enough right now. What are we going to do to make sure people can stay employed or get reemployed in the coming months?
Well, and Omar, I think that, there are folks who have been very critical of the premiers for flying here. Certainly, it was designed to put pressure on the federal government. There was apparently no ask to actually meet with federal government officials while they were here. But is it unreasonable to say, look, COVID-19 has really damaged our healthcare system. This government says they're going to protect Canadians. It's time for them to step up.
Well, look, I was a chief of staff to a provincial health minister in Ontario, so I know that provinces and premiers and provincial health ministers never lose an opportunity to needle the federal government for more funding on healthcare, as they should. The federal share has declined over years from a high of about 50% of healthcare spending to less than 30% right now. That being said, I'll point out that if you take the level of COVID-related spending coming out of Ottawa versus, let's say, a province like where I live in Ontario, the federal share, according to the provincial financial accountability officer, is about 97%. versus 3% of the provincial share. So yes, I think I agree. I think that the economy is very important. I also think you can't completely disconnect it from the public health response. I think what we'll hear from the Governor General and from the Prime Minister tonight is the message that there are actions that we have to take now, aggressively as a country, as Canadians from coast to coast, that will prevent those shutdowns that will have a very negative effect on our economy. But we have to take those actions now so that those can be avoided.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see exactly what makes it into this speech, what level of detail. We do know from liberal sources that, well, this will be a big picture, big idea delivery, which a throne speech always is, regardless of the stripe of the government. Not a lot of numbers, not a lot of detail. It sets the trend in the agenda. There will be some sort of a fall fiscal update. It will not be a budget, though. We're not expecting that until the spring, which means we will have gone through the entire year of 2020 without there being a budget. And some opposition members saying they can't make a decision on whether or not to hold this government up based on ideas alone. So we're certainly hearing from NDP sources and from Green sources that they are going to wait to not only take a look at what's in this speech, but to also see how it is being supported financially. Right now, you are seeing the arrival of the Prime Minister of Canada's motorcade. We're expecting Mr. Trudeau to step out momentarily there. You can see his RCMP security detail around him. Everyone wearing masks in this time of COVID-19. Let's watch Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as he arrives to receive the salute. He is receiving the salute from the Honour Guard. What you hear in the background there is some kind of a protest. We're working to find out who exactly those individuals are and what they're protesting, but you could hear them shouting and chanting throughout the speech. They stopped once the national anthem started. So we will be keeping a close eye on who is making their voice heard today. Obviously, it is a time in Canada when a lot of people are intensely involved and concerned about the future here. So now that we have had the Prime Minister arrive, next we are expecting the Governor General to arrive in her motorcade shortly. She, of course, reads the speech. In terms of what we are expecting in the speech today, something we would all love to know. Let's take another look with our strategists at where we think this might go. As we head into this, I'm going to play a clip of Dominic LeBlanc for our panel. This was on the West Block this past Sunday when I asked him what Canadians should be expecting in the throne speech and if there might be any really big surprises. Here's what he told me.
There won't be any surprises, Mercedes. We've been saying very clearly that the pandemic and the health and safety of Canadians is the priority. So people shouldn't be surprised that the government's focus will be squarely on that. But as I said, they also expect the government to focus on issues as important as climate change and a successful economic recovery. We'll be speaking to those issues as well in the throne speech.
Greg, going to you, the green recovery, it was such a big issue. I know there's been a divide inside cabinet. Those who say now is the time, we're spending a lot of money, it's the time to try to accelerate those 2030 Paris targets, it's the time to accelerate the clean fuel standards, make drastic changes, but changes that could provide jobs. Others in the cabinet were saying, no, not the time for that. Canadians are going to see this as us pushing an ideological agenda during a pandemic. Where do you think they're going to have settled on that today?
I don't think you're going to see a mention of anything around climate change or green recovery without a mention of jobs. I can tell you a little bit about the focus groups or roundtables that were done internally to do this. The finance minister, the parliamentary secretary for finance, actually met with the environment minister and the PS for environment. So during the entire time that they've been preparing this, it's been finance on one side, environment on the other side. Mercedes, just in terms of a previous panel, we talked about childcare. There was actually a childcare deal in November. As the oldest person on the panel, I was there in November of 2005. Ken Dryden had 10 provinces on board, $5 billion. The NDP pulled the plug. You can still make NDP staffers from that time light their hair on fire, even in an article in Saturday's National Post on this. The reason I bring this up is because even though you might have some really good initiatives in this speech from the throne, it's still a minority government. It doesn't mean necessarily that the opposition parties are still going to support you. So there still is a lot of suspense about what will happen in the coming days.
Greg, we're just jumping in for a moment here because we are seeing the 21-gun salute to the Governor General Julie Payette. She has arrived. She is on the dais there. She just greeted the usher of the Black Rod, and you can hear God Save the Queen being played. Some Indigenous drumming and singing in the background there. One of the big questions about what will be in the speech today, reconciliation. The Trudeau government has promised a lot on that. And certainly after a summer of protests related to anti-Black racism and Indigenous Canadians raising questions about how they have been treated, not only by Canada as the state, but this particular government as well, we may well be seeing something in the speech today about reconciliation, about trying to help racialized Canadians participate fully in the economy. That's something that I've heard over and over again from Liberal sources, and we are just seeing there the Governor General inspecting the Honour Guard as she arrives before she delivers this speech. Long-term care, another big issue we could be hearing about today in this speech. Melissa, long-term care and healthcare are traditionally provincial areas. Conservatives typically like the federal government to stay out of the province's territory, but that seems to have changed in light of this pandemic.
Well, I don't think that the responsibility or the jurisdiction matter has changed. I still think that most provinces would want autonomy about how to best spend those healthcare dollars in a way that they are best placed to do so. That doesn't mean that they don't need more healthcare dollars, more plans around rapid testing, more plans about lab capacity, more plans about what we're going to do to put a ring fence around long-term care. Look, I think this goes back to the beginning, where this speech actually needs to address the concerns of Canadians right now. Because if most people are watching right now, they're watching a lot of pomp and circumstance. They're watching a lot of process, and they really want to plan for how we're going to get through this, not only until the end of the year, but in the next 6 months after that, 12 months after that, and the longer view of 18 months. Are we going to be okay? And they're looking for this government to tell them that's the case.
Well, and certainly a lot of Canadians wondering if they will be okay as we prepare to hear what the government will be presenting in this throne speech today. What is their vision for Canada, which is what this is really all about. The justification for the Prime Minister in suspending Parliament to do this, which shut down the committees which were investigating the We Charity scandal, the committees that were investigating the Canada-China relationship. All of those shut down when Parliament was prorogued. The Prime Minister said that they needed time to hit the reset agenda. And certainly in that month, things were very busy. The resignation, Finance Minister Bill Morneau, Chrystia Freeland now in that seat. She will have had a very important role in determining this speech today as the person who is not only the Deputy Prime Minister and effectively the Prime Minister's really chief operator. If he were the chairman of the board, she would be the CEO. She will also be the person who decides what exactly is spent where. And when it comes to spending, we've been talking about green spending, and that was certainly something the government was looking at, but may no longer be the case. I want to play a quick clip for our viewers of what Prime Minister Trudeau had to say about that green recovery when he did an interview with Global BC's Sophie Liu earlier this month.
When we talk about a green recovery, what we're actually talking about is a long-term recovery for our economy. We know the world is going towards greater energy efficiency. We know the world is going towards lower carbon. We know the world is moving towards more renewable energy. This is the way the world is going. We need to make sure that we're leading the way, that we're part of that in a way that reassures people in existing industries, people who have jobs now or are worried about their jobs because of COVID or have lost their jobs because of COVID, that our plan for the future of the economy includes them.
Siavash, I want to go to you on this first. Do you think that people still care about a green economy at this point, or are they just focused on trying to get through the next few months as they deal with all the fear and uncertainty of a pandemic?
That's a great question, Mercedes. I don't think the two are separated from each other. At the same time that we're dealing with the COVID second wave, we've also been watching the fires in the west coast of the United States and parts of Canada. And many of us across the country saw the smoke that took over our skies for a few days last week. So this is not a time that is an either or. There is one other piece that I think we should be focusing on is that there is cost to all the changes and the transformational changes that we're going to be experiencing in the next little while. And this pandemic has had winners and losers. 20 individuals in Canada have increased their wealth by $37 billion throughout this pandemic, while millions of people have lost their jobs and have lost their livelihood. In 4 days, as David said, we're going to have about 3 million Canadians who will be worse off with the disappearance of CERB. Those are the situations that the government has to address. And I think it's time for the wealthiest individuals and corporations who can afford contributing more so that we get through this crisis together. It's time to actually bring some tax fairness to this country and ensure that we can get through this crisis together.
Well, and those questions about how to pay for things are certainly very dominant. We're just watching there as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Richard Wagner, is speaking with senators as we wait for the throne speech to begin. Melissa, paying it down, we're looking at a $1 trillion debt here. Do Canadians care anymore, though, how much is being spent as long as they're getting the programs that they need?
I think there is a subset of Canadians that do care, and I think that is growing, knowing that you're going to have to pay for this eventually. The bills come due on all of the spending. And while some of the crucial supports that were put in at the very beginning, the CERB got out the door quickly. The government had a number of other programs that weren't well subscribed to, that didn't take care of the needs of the small business owners across the country, and those who found themselves sort of on the unlucky side of this pandemic. But I think Conservatives and frankly, a lot of Canadians will start to look at this. How are we going to pay for all of this? The throne speech isn't going to give you the details on that. And so we sit and we wait. Where is this money coming from? Do we have the capacity to borrow more? And when are we going to start paying this down? That is a concern for certainly middle-class Canadians, certainly the next generation that's going to have to pay for this.
I believe we have a clip from Jagmeet Singh that I'm going to throw to in just a few seconds about what he wants to see in this speech. We asked him that question because this is a minority parliament. And so the Liberals really have to find a way to put things in here that appeal to different opposition parties, at least enough to keep them in power. And that means the NDP is really in the driver's seat. So take a listen to what Jagmeet Singh told me they'll be looking for.
People are so hopeful about what they're going to say, and they're looking forward to it, and they're thinking this is going to be great. But we know the Liberal government has done in the past, said the right things and not acted on it. So we're giving them a chance. Here are two immediate things. Your first act in government is coming back after shutting down Parliament is to cut the help to people. Don't do that. Instead, extend CERB, bring a plan to keep the same level of support, and let's put in place paid sick leave for all.
So we heard from Jagmeet Singh there. We are just waiting, and you're seeing on Pool for the procession to begin into the chamber. When it begins, I will jump in so that our viewers can have a look at that. But Greg, you have been on Parliament Hill for a long time. You're a master negotiator who can go between parties yourself. How important is it for the Liberals to have consulted in advance of this to make sure they have enough in there to either have the NDP and the Greens or the Bloc vote for them, since the Conservatives have already basically said, we're out?
Welcome to my fireside chat. I was a bit disappointed at how long it took the Liberals to do to consult. I was told that they would, and to me it just seems natural because, if I could point out, a year ago, Trudeau and Premier Ford were, the biggest of enemies, and now they're doing events together. Why is that? They've got smart advisors around them. They're both smart politicians. I think it's because Canadians really don't want to see a lot of partisanship right now. To that point, then the Liberal government better be able to point to in this speech where they have consulted and listened to the opposition parties. Perhaps it's a communications exercise at this point in terms of the speech versus a budget or a fiscal update. But I think it's really important. Canadians don't really care about partisan warfare right now. They care about where their next paycheck is coming. They care about whether or not their kids are going to be safe if they go back to school.
Well, and Greg, speaking of that, I have to ask you, when we look at what we're expecting and what's needed, the CERB certainly is top of mind for a lot of people. It's about to expire. And if we do end up in a second wave, there's a good chance that, unfortunately, a number of Canadians will lose their jobs on top of those who have already lost their jobs, as more businesses can't make it through. One of the criticisms that the government faced is that they did a lot for individuals, which wasn't the criticism, but that they didn't do enough for small and medium-sized businesses to keep them going so that those people wouldn't have to be laid off and be put on the CERB. Do you think we'll see more for business in this throne speech?
Yeah, the indications I've been told that we will see that. I mean, remember, there are people who are going to argue that CERB is just, free money for people. No, that's not what it was about. It was about giving people a reason to stay home and to stay safe. One of the things, Melissa rightly noted that they got a lot of money out the door very, very quickly, but they acknowledged that not all of it was going to be perfect. And I can tell you, as somebody who works in the consulting industry, the government was still very open to hearing from stakeholders to find out what, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago, what programs worked, why didn't it work for you, what would need to be changed for it to work.
So I think we have the procession entering the chamber now. That is a very different looking chamber that we see today. Typically, it would be packed with senators. It would have all of the Supreme Court justices. Instead, you see only one. That is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Richard Wagner. CDS, Jonathan Vance, on his way out. We expected that he might be replaced before the throne speech, but that hasn't happened yet. Also, Commissioner of the RCMP, Brenda Lucki, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and the Governor General taking her seat as we prepare to find out what exactly is going to be in this throne speech. What are we going to see in terms of economic and social supports? What will there be for health supports? How is the government planning to get us through the challenging weeks and months ahead if there is, in fact, a second wave? What about our elderly? Lots of questions about long-term care homes that we've largely stopped asking in recent months, but they were front and center in the last wave, and while this wave so far has been mostly young people. There are concerns that could change. Let's listen to what's going on in the chamber.
That it is the pleasure of Her Excellency the Governor General that they attend her immediately in the Senate chamber. Huissier de bâton noir, rendezvous à la Chambre des communes.
Please proceed to the House of Commons. The Governor General of Canada will deliver her speech from the throne in the Senate chamber.
You're taking a look at the usher of the black rod there. He is stepping up ceremonially. It all looks like something from another era, doesn't it? A reminder of where our parliamentary democracy has in fact come from, and the many trappings that look purely dramatic, but they in fact form a ceremonial function. And there is the departure of the usher of the black rod, who represents the House of Commons. Our David Akin is just outside there. I believe David can speak. He can't when the procession is there. David, are you able to chat with us right now?
Mercedes, actually, I'm going to be hushed in just a few minutes as the gentleman usher of the black rod heads. Yes, as he heads off to the House of Commons. Remember, for folks not watching, normally the chambers are side by side in the center block. You just walk down the hall, knock on the door. Here he comes now, so I'm going to have to pause, Mercedes. You can wait with
David,
bated
you
breath.
pause.
I'll be right back to you.
We'll be right back to you. And take a look. You'll see him walking out there now. There is the timing. All of this represents the separation between the Crown in Canada and our democratically elected government. So certainly very interesting to see all of this and to remember that there's a reason for it. Just outside the Senate building, a lot of protesters. Our Abigail Beeman was out there. She tells me that there are a range of causes outside the building protesting, from people who are anti-abortion to people who are concerned about climate change. You could hear them chanting. And David, I believe we can bring you back in now. We're just moments ahead of the throne speech.
We've been told we've got 12 minutes. We got 12 minutes, you and I, Mercedes, until the gentleman usher of the black rod leads MPs by. And what I wanted to say was, you and I know this, people who work around the parliamentary precinct, all our panelists know this. Right now, the two chambers in our system, the House of Commons and the Senate, are quite separate from each other. They're at either ends, really, of the parliamentary precinct. The Senate, that's where I am right now, is, as you mentioned, right across from the Chateau Laurier. That is to the east of Parliament Hill. And the House of Commons is in the West Block. And that's because the Centre Block right now is in the middle of a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar reconstruction. The implications for today's event is this. Well, you've been watching some activities in the Red Chamber in the Senate. Meanwhile, back in the House of Commons, some MPs have gathered. And this is kind of some important news that happened while we've been talking, is all parties have come to some agreements about how to proceed with the normal business of the House of Commons. This is something House leaders have been talking about for the last couple of weeks, and the government House leader, Pablo Rodriguez, was just up on his feet in the House. He's just put some stuff out on his Twitter feed, and he says all parties have come to an agreement to agree on some form of voting remotely. And that means MPs will be able to vote on confidence motions or other things in person, but also from their ridings, from their offices, safely and remotely. That's a big hurdle. The Conservatives were the holdout on that one. They were very concerned that remote voting would be able to occur securely, and there has been some agreement. So you're going to see the House of Commons, by and large, pick up its daily activities and its daily routines, and again, MPs will be able to vote remotely. Now, again, for today's ceremony, MPs were just talking about that and going through this the motions to establish that, while all the ceremonial stuff was happening outside the Senate. So now, the gentleman usher of the black rod is, quote unquote, knocking on the door of the House of Commons. That's where he's headed, right by me, to the other end of the parliamentary precinct, knock on the door, and essentially what he does is say, hey, the Queen, in the person, the representative of the Governor General, would like to see you, and you are commanded to attend to her here in the Senate chamber. And so after that command is given, a few MPs, normally it will be mostly all of them, but in this case it's just going to be a few, they will come down. They're going to take a little van down to the end of this thing. They'll go into the Senate chamber, and then we will finally get on with hearing the Senate speech.
Well, what we're seeing just now is the van carrying the usher of the block rod driving up onto Parliament Hill as he heads up to go knock with his grand mace on the door of the House of Commons to retrieve those members of Parliament who will head back with him and stand behind that symbolic line representing the difference between appointed and elected officials, the separation between the House and the Senate. As you said, I remember when they used to walk back and forth in Centre Block. Now it's a drive. I mean, I guess at least the weather is nice. This would be worse in -20 with blowing snow, but it also is a very socially distant speech.
Yes, you're right. It is a gorgeous day here in Ottawa. One other interesting thing, too, that we want to catch people up on is the normal course of events would be this. We'd hear the speech from the throne, and then all the MPs would go back to the House, and now we start to debate. And usually the first persons to debate the speech from the throne would be the Prime Minister, the leader of the official opposition, and then other opposition leaders. But as everybody knows, the leader of the official opposition, Aaron O'Toole, and his wife Rebecca, have both been diagnosed with COVID-19, and as a result, they're in self-isolation. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, also in self-isolation after being diagnosed with COVID-19. He's back in his home in Shawinigan. So 2 of the 3 opposition leaders cannot be here and present to either listen to the speech from the throne or in person participate. Now, what does that mean? We've been told there is an agreement between the Bloc and the Conservatives. Their leaders will not be delivering a video address in the House of Commons. They're going to wait until they're better and until they can do it in person in the House. And that'll be probably till at least October 1st. Hopefully all goes well with their health. But also tonight, of course, Mercedes, we've got this extraordinary address by the Prime Minister. He's going to get 15 minutes from us and other television networks to speak to an issue of national importance. That's at 6:30 Eastern. And then the opposition will get 15 minutes to respond. I can tell you it will not be Aaron O'Toole responding for the Conservatives. We still haven't been told who's going to respond. Monsieur Blanchet apparently is ready to respond via Skype because we can't send a camera to his home because of health reasons. And Jagmeet Singh will respond for the NDP. So again, it's very unique circumstances. The House of Commons does have a system for a hybrid activity involving Zoom calls and things like that. But Aaron O'Toole,
I'm going to pause you for just a moment, David. You're seeing this is the usher of the black rod knocking on the door of the House of Commons chamber.
Un message from Her Excellency the Governor General. Un message de Son Excellence la Gouverneur Générale.
Yes. Rita, I'm just going to cut you off just briefly as we listen to the usher from Black Rod here, who's arrived at the House of Commons. At arms in the House of Commons, all part of this ceremony. Sergeant at Arms is, of course, responsible for security in the House of Commons, runs the responsibility for keeping parliamentarians safe.
Speaker, a message from Her Excellency the Governor General. Monsieur le Président, un message de Son Excellence la Gouverneur Générale.
Admit the messenger.
Okay, we're just about to hear from the usher of the Black Rod. He has just been given permission to enter with a message. He is the messenger who the Sergeant at Arms was referring to, delivering the Governor General's message. Take a listen to what he has to say.
Mr. Speaker, it is the pleasure of Her Excellency the Governor General that this honourable House attend her immediately in the chamber of the Senate. Monsieur le Président, c'est le plaisir de Son Excellence.
It is the pleasure of Her Excellency, the Governor General, for this honourable chamber to immediately attend her speech in the Senate chamber.
All right, and there is the usher of the Black Rod departing the House of Commons, having come to invite members of Parliament to travel with him. And you see Jagmeet Singh there, just going out of range on the left corner of the camera. He and Elizabeth May, two leaders who were able to actually physically be there, as we were just discussing with our David Akin. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, not able to be there, diagnosed with COVID-19. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet also not able to be there, diagnosed with COVID-19. There are also staff members in those parties who have COVID-19. A lot of concern right now, not just across Canada about this, but very much for these members of Parliament and their potential exposure. If politicians generally are around more people, they're up there today where there have been cases of COVID-19. So we are not going to be seeing the usual full sitting. Certainly not all of the MPs, just a select number wearing masks, traveling socially distancing down the street to the Senate to receive this speech. And as we were hearing from David Akin, there will be a response at a later time from those opposition leaders because they are unable to do so in person. Yves-François Blanchet still choosing to do his via Skype. Erin O'Toole not providing the Conservative response. We're not sure why exactly that is. He may not have wanted to do it over video. He is also suffering from COVID-19. And so this is a very, very different and in a way a very somber throne speech. You see all that pomp and circumstance, but there's a reminder that there's a very real health threat happening right now across Canada and on Parliament Hill as they try to find the safest way possible to deliver this speech. Also remarkable what David was saying, and we can bring him back in before we have to lose him again when this procession heads back past him. But David, I think that electronic voting bit is very interesting because the government will be subject to a confidence vote. They've said and agreed and volunteered to make themselves subject to this. The Conservatives were dead set against remote voting for a long time. Do you think that the reality that is set in with their leader becoming ill has made them reconsider how important it is to sit in person versus having the remote options as well?
Well, I can tell you I've had lots of conversations in the last few days with folks that are among the senior parliamentary leaders in the Conservatives, and they say it's flat out, listen, the situation, the health situation has changed remarkably, and of course, most notably is that their leader is out of action with what we believe are mild symptoms. That's what the leader's office has been saying, Erin O'Toole, with mild symptoms, but that could be, it's difficult for him to talk because he might have a cough, might have a small fever. We know that COVID-19 reflects itself in different ways. And we saw the entire Bloc Québécois caucus has gone into self-isolation because they were close to someone, their leader, and another staff member who had COVID-19. So I think that's really brought home the reality to a lot of members of Parliament that there's got to be a way for them to do their business, and the most important part of the business is voting. Got to be a way to do that if they can't be in the chamber. And there was concerns initially, especially in a confidence vote in a minority parliament, all of a sudden the Zoom cuts out and someone's hand is up, is it down? I'm sure that I know that parliamentarians have been studying this issue. They're not going into this lightly. They've been looking at some of those scenarios, and they finally come to some agreement. That agreement, and we're still waiting to get details, basically public health officials, they don't have exact jurisdiction over the parliamentary precinct, but they're providing advice to the precinct, which by and large the precinct is taking. And what they've said is the maximum number of MPs they want to see in the chamber, which normally holds 338 MPs plus pages and things, the maximum number they want to see is 87, and that's it. And I don't know if you will see 87 once we get going. I think it might be above 60, 75, and there will be some agreement among the whips from each party to maintain the relative balance of power in the House of Commons. In other words, there should always be more people on the opposition benches than on the government benches, things like that. And we're going to see people on House duty which might involve House duty in their pajamas from their basement way back in their home riding. Who knows? But it is going to be a little bit different, but it's going to be more normal, back to some pre-pandemic days. MPs can introduce private members' motions and bills, and that was very important for a lot of members of Parliament. We'll see a daily question period. We'll see committees start up. We'll see petitions will be able to be presented. So MPs believe this is important stuff in this time, and I think everybody sort of figured out we got to find a way to do this. We just can't object to, in this case, remote voting.
Well, we're just watching the MPs making their way in those white parliamentary buses up to the Senate, where they will take in the throne speech. A select small number of MPs today, as we cannot have the usual packed Senate. There's always a bit, as you know, David, of the jockeying to try to be one of the people that gets to go to hear this speech, one of the designated individuals. It's a great honor to be there. It's a chance to see firsthand how the government's laying it out. It's exact opposite this year. It's still an honor, but a lot of people having to give up their spots. You've got to be distant. You've got to be 6 feet apart. You've got to be in your mask.
And I can tell you, to be honest, Mercedes, it is a really nice day to be outside Ottawa today in a pair of shorts and maybe a polo shirt in a park. It's a little warm here in the Senate foyer, and having to wear business attire. And so if you are the lucky guy or gal to be in the Senate chamber, don't forget MPs by and large stand at the back of the Senate chamber. It's not going to be as hot and stuffy, but it is warm in there. And as I say, the MPs will have to stand at the back. We've been told that this is a speech that's going to be certainly longer than the speech from the throne that opened up this Parliament. This one could run, we've been told, somewhere maybe around an hour. The Governor General going to read it, parts in English, parts in French, of course, and both official languages. So it will be standing around for an hour once it gets going. And I think, just taking a look at the program, I think we are a little bit behind time today. I think the speech was to have started at about 2:40 Eastern. So we'll get to it. The GG's in her place, and we're just waiting for the MP and the gentleman usher of the Black Rod, who I must say, when he last passed me, I think he heard me talking, Mercedes, and he gave me a bit of a dirty look. So I'm going to be very careful this time that I'm not saying a word when he comes by with the MPs.
You definitely don't want to be on the receiving end of a look there. David Akin, thank you for joining us. We're going to be watching them walk just behind you momentarily. For those outside Ottawa who don't know, it's only about a 2-block drive from Parliament down to the Senate. That's why the turnaround on this is so quick. And there we're seeing inside the Senate chamber, I believe that's Prime Minister Trudeau who we're seeing there from behind. There's the elbow bump. Yep, no handshaking or hugs in this current environment. We are just seeing now the usher of the Black Rod pulling up outside. Another number of protesters. Our producer Crystal Ogue is out there, and Crystal telling us she's seeing Indigenous rights protesters. She is seeing anti-maskers, anti-abortion protesters, a whole range of people, climate protesters on both sides of the political spectrum. I'm also hearing from security sources in Ottawa that they think there's around 60 people out there. They are keeping a close eye on that, since there's some divergent and very passionate perspectives out there that come from opposite ends of the spectrum as this all unfolds. And there is the Governor General. She's speaking with RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki ahead of this speech. She's going to be speaking for quite some time today. We could have an hour-long speech, and there she is getting the cue that it's time for her to prepare, potentially to take her seat. Here comes the usher of the Black Rod. This time, he is accompanied by members of Parliament. Right behind him, a member of the Parliamentary Protective Service, and right in front of him as well, as we get ready to find out what direction is the Liberal government going to be going in with this speech. Let's go just quickly to our strategists again. Before we hear the speech, final bets from our strategists. You get 30 seconds each on what you're expecting to hear, starting with you, Melissa.
Well, this is certainly not the visual the government wants. I think you'll see Mr. Trudeau say whatever he's going to say tonight. So the Governor General is not giving out the government's message on the way forward. And I expect to see very few details and a less grand vision than we were originally thought.
Okay, Kievash.
I'm hoping to see some real results for ordinary Canadians as we're heading into the second wave. CERB extension, access to sick leave for everybody so that they can take time off if they need to. These are the things that we really need to do in order to protect ourselves.
Great. And final bets to you, Greg, about what you think you're going to see in the speech today or what you'd like to see.
Some foundations around health and safety of Canadians, also a path back to economic security, and then perhaps some big thinking about fixing things that weren't working that great before, and a chance for the Prime Minister to articulate his vision about what he thinks Canada is going to look like in the coming years.
Thank you to our strategists. We'll be checking in with them after we hear from the speech as well with their reaction. It's going to begin any moment now. As you can see there, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he looks pleased with whatever's in there, happy with his final decision on what's made it into the speech, one that the government has had to carefully craft. And as you can see, those are members of Parliament who we're looking at right now. I can see Candice Bergen, who is the deputy leader of the Conservative Party. I believe it is Gerald Deltel next to her. Can't make out anyone else from behind the masks at this distance just yet. It is one of the challenges as we try to identify who's there, but those will be MPs from all parties represented, just a small number of them who will be going in to hear this speech today, expected to begin in just a few moments as this goes forward. And as we've been hearing, we are also expecting a highly unusual address to the nation tonight from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We don't know quite what that will be about yet, but I am told to expect that it will be an urgent or emergent tone, that it has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic and the government's approach to it. The government will likely be framing this, and I think you'll see some of the throne speech framed as being at a crossroads. Whether or not the opposition agrees with that position, we shall see. Here comes the procession heading towards the Senate chamber. Now, this just arrived. Thank you to Greg McEachran, who's passed it to me, on the notice paper at the House of Commons, which tells us what the House of Commons will be doing. At 2 p.m., this has gone up. The Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion has introduced a bill, an act relating to economic recovery in response to COVID-19. So whatever is in this speech, they have already introduced a bill that will start to implement those measures, and we'll get a look at what exactly is in that bill. We'll have a sense of that here. This could be the changes to employment insurance. It could be the extension of the CERB or the creation of a new CERB, and any other measures related to economic recovery. Business could be in there. So this will be very interesting to see, but the government's certainly not wasting any time with introducing that bill. Here is the usher of the Black Rod entering the Senate. And I'm hearing that David knows what's in that bill. David Akin, can you tell us what we're expecting in that bill?
Yes, so that first bill, that the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, that's Carla Qualtrough, the MP from Delta, BC, and that is the bill that creates these new benefits. There's a new benefit for caregivers, and again, this was something the government already announced, a new benefit for caregivers. So if you're a parent and you have to stay home because your kid's school is shut, this is a $500 a week benefit. It'll be paid retroactively. You can get it for a maximum of 26 weeks. There's also a sick leave benefit. So if your employer doesn't
David, I'm going to jump in there for just a moment because I can see the Governor General holding her speech. Sorry about that, but good to know. This is so far from what we know, not new. It is what the government announced. Here we go with the speech to the throne. Governor General Julie Payette opening it to begin the speech.
Honourable Senators, members of the House of Commons, fellow Canadians, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs.
Every day, millions of people on the planet are faced with despair, whether they're natural disasters, conflict, discrimination, or inequalities. However, humanity has never faced a single enemy, an insidious enemy that respects no borders and spreads everywhere and can strike at any time.
To overcome a pandemic requires the work and resolve of every order of government, of every community, and of every one of us. We don't decide when hardship comes, but here in Canada, we have decided how we wanted to address it. We have adapted in remarkable ways. Nous, les Canadiens, avons fait notre part.
Canadians
Nous avons
have
changé
done
nos
our
habitudes,
level best. We have
reporté nos
changed
projets.
our habits,
Nous sommes passés
pushed
au
back our
télétravail,
plans,
où avons dû
and
complètement
began working
réinventer
from
notre
home
travail.
or
Tout cela en
restructured
prenant
our
soin
work,
les uns des autres.
all the while looking after each other.
Nous sommes immensément redevables
We
à ceux
are
qui ont servi et qui servent
immensely
encore en première
thankful
ligne, au
towards
personnel de la
essential
santé
workers,
et aux travailleurs
healthcare
essentiels,
workers,
aux femmes
and
et aux hommes
all
qui servent en
individuals on
uniforme,
the front
aux
line,
bénévoles et aux
for
dirigeants
volunteers
partout au pays.
and leaders from across the country.
There has been a lot of suffering, and we all mourn those who have passed. We trust science to lead the fight until a safe and effective vaccine becomes available. But until then, we must keep our guards up, using the tools that are available to us now, such as testing, treatments, and physical distancing measures. Like a reed in high winds, we may sway, but we will not break, because our roots are firmly in place, our goals clear, and because we have hope. The hope that lifts the soul on dark days and keeps us focused on the future. Les Canadiens ont déjà vécu des temps incertains et ont toujours
Canadians
démontré
have
que la
faced
détermination,
uncertainty in the
le souci
past
des
and have
autres,
always
le
shown
courage
that
et le
looking
bon
after
sens
each other,
définissent notre
courage,
nation.
and common sense
We
define
must
our
bring all
nation.
those qualities to bear once again and continue to work for the common good and for a better, safer, and more just society. This is who we are and what will see us through to brighter days. For over 150 years, parliamentarians have worked together to chart Canada's path forward. Your predecessors met when Confederation was only a few months old, setting the course for a young country. They stood united through Canada's toughest days, leading the nation through wars and depression. And as they did, each parliamentarian was called to meet their times. Today, Canadians expect you to do the same. They expect you to work together on their behalf and meet this crucial moment. Less than a year ago, we gathered here for a throne speech to open the 43rd Parliament. Since then, our realities have changed, and so must our approach. Over 9,000 Canadians have died in 6 months. For our neighbors in the United States, this figure is over 200,000. Globally, it's nearly 1 million. But these are not just numbers. These are friends and family, neighbors and colleagues. The pandemic is the story of parents who have died alone, without loved ones to hold their hands. It is the story of kids who have gone months without seeing friends, of workers who have lost their jobs. Les 6 derniers mois ont dévoilé les lacunes fondamentales de notre
The last 6
société
months have
et celles des
shown
sociétés du monde
cracks
entier.
in our society
Cette
as
pandémie a été
elsewhere.
difficile pour tout
This
le monde.
pandemic has been
Mais pour ceux
difficult
dont
on
la
everyone.
situation est déjà difficile,
But for
le
those
fardeau a été encore
who
plus
are
grand.
already facing hardship,
Pour les
the
parents,
burden is
et en
heaviest
particulier pour
for
les mères,
parents
qui ont
and
été
mothers,
confrontés à des
more
dilemmes
specifically,
impossibles entre leurs
that
enfants
have
et leur
faced
carrière.
difficult decisions
Pour les
between
Canadiens
careers
racisés
and
et les
children,
peuples autochtones
for
qui se heurtent à
racialized
des
Canadians
obstacles
and
systémiques.
Indigenous individuals
Pour
who
les jeunes qui
face
s'inquiètent de ce que l'avenir
systematic
leur réserve. Pour les
problems,
personnes âgées
and
qui sont isolées,
youth who worry
effrayées
about the
et les
future,
plus exposés
the
au risque.
elderly who
Et
are
pour les
most
travailleurs
exposed
qui,
to risk,
tout en
and
gagnant
for
les
those
salaires les plus
workers
bas dans les
who
secteurs les plus précaires,
earn the
ont été
lowest
en première
wages
ligne durant la
and are the
pandémie.
most precarious
Nous devons
are on the
nous
front
attaquer à ces
lines.
problèmes d'aujourd'hui
We
sans toutefois
must
oublier
address
ceux qui
these
nous attendent
issues
demain.
without forgetting the
Le monde
future.
est entré dans cette pandémie en faisant face aux
The
risques
world
et aux
entered
conséquences
this
des changements
pandemic
climatiques.
facing
Une
climate
leçon que
change
la
and its risks.
COVID-19 nous a enseignée,
A lesson COVID-19 has taught us is that we must meet these challenges with determination on all these fronts: healthcare, economy, equality, and the environment. We must act bravely. The government will do so.
The government's approach will have 4 foundations. The first foundation of this plan is to fight the pandemic and save lives. The second foundation of the government's plan is supporting people and businesses through this crisis as long as it lasts, whatever it takes. Effectively dealing with the health crisis is the best thing we can do for the economy. Government action has already helped Canadians stay safe and buffered the worst economic impacts. The third foundation is to build back better to create a stronger, more resilient Canada. To do this, we must keep strengthening the middle class and helping people working hard to join in, and continue creating jobs and building long-term competitiveness with clean growth. We must also keep building safer communities for everyone. The fourth and final foundation of this plan is to stand up for who we are as Canadians. We cannot forget what has made us a country that is welcoming, a country that celebrates 2 official languages, that achieves progress on gender equality, walks the road of reconciliation, and fights discrimination of every kind. This is our generation's crossroads. Do we move Canada forward or let people be left behind? Do we come out of this stronger or paper over the cracks that the crisis has exposed? This is the time to remember who we are as Canadians. This is the opportunity to contain the global crisis and build back better together. The first foundation of the government's approach is protecting Canadians from COVID-19. This is priority number 1. It is the job of the federal government to look out for all Canadians, and especially for our most vulnerable. We need to work together because beating this virus is a Team Canada effort. Over the last 6 months, Canadians have stood united and strong. Their actions embody what has always been the purpose of the federal government: bringing Canadians together to achieve common goals. Personal protective equipment has been shipped across the country. Members of the Canadian Forces were there in long-term care homes. Close to 9 million Canadians were helped with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and over 3.5 million jobs were supported by the wage subsidy. The government will continue to have people's backs, just like Canadians have each other's backs. Through the first wave, contact tracing and testing ramped up across the country. The surge this fall further reinforces what we already know, that we must do even more. The federal government will be there to help the provinces increase their testing capacity. Canadians should not be waiting in line for hours to get a test. Du même coup, le gouvernement examine toutes les technologies et toutes les options permettant d'offrir des tests plus rapides afin d'aider les Canadiens d'un océan à l'autre.
Options to help Canadians from coast to coast. Once it is approved in Canada, the government will do everything to implement these solutions, as well as intervention for screening, to meet quickly the urgent needs in that respect, especially in remote and Indigenous communities. Local public health authorities are at the core of the efforts our country is deploying to fight outbreaks before they propagate. We are also mindful of the devastating economic impacts of the pandemic. In order to outbreaks extending further, communities may have to impose appropriate measures. In order to facilitate the task of public health authorities and reduce the impact of evidence-based decisions on local enterprises, the government will endeavor to provide additional financial assistance if companies have to close their doors temporarily because of government decisions. Such a measure will allow decisions to be made by placing the health of Canadians at the top of the list of priorities. The government will also continue to respond to all the needs of the community. To that end, the government has already invested over $19 billion as part of an accord with the provinces and territories in order to contribute to all efforts to reinforce health network capacities, including personal protection equipment. To remedy the difficulties encountered by provinces and territories during the back-to-school period, the federal government has invested billions of dollars in safe back-to-school programs, as well as additional funding for First Nations communities. Those funds will be used to ensure the safety of children and staff in classrooms, whether it be by helping schools purchase cleaning products or update their ventilation systems.
These commitments build on federal investment to support people who are most at risk and those who care for them, including with the federal wage top-up for personal support workers. People on the front lines who have been looking after seniors do vital work, and the government will continue to have their backs. At the same time, the government will continue to support Canadians as they take action to keep each other safe. Les gens font déjà leur part en portant un masque.
People are already doing their part by wearing a mask. And that is how we can further this effort in collaboration with private sector partners. The federal government has designed the COVID Alert app. People in Ontario, Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick and Saskatchewan now have an additional tool to ensure their own safety and that of others. The government hopes that these tools will help shorten the pandemic so that everyone can do their part and be better protected. The government will continue trying to provide for personal protection equipment for Canadians as needed. Last spring, the government launched a call to Canadians, and Canadians responded. In many businesses, workers joined their efforts, and Canadian companies in less than 6 months started all types of equipment. The government will continue reinforcing that capacity by securing jobs. Supply chain. Canadians are mobilizing, whether it be by manufacturing equipment, by using the COVID Alert app, or by wearing a mask. Researchers and scientists in Canada are putting their expertise at the service of efforts against the pandemic. The best way to end this pandemic is to find a safe and effective vaccine. Canada's vaccine strategy aims to guarantee that Canadians can be vaccinated as soon as the vaccine will be approved. Types of vaccine candidates, Canada is exploring diverse options. The government has already ensured access to candidates and therapeutic products while pursuing development efforts here. In order to distribute vaccines to Canadians already, the government has made additional investments in its distribution capacity, whether it be the working group vaccines, offers the best advice on purchasing and deploying vaccines, or the immunity working group, which deals with the effect of COVID-19 on health products. The greatest scientific minds of Canada are assisting the government at every step. The medical and scientific fight against this virus is crucial. just as those of Canadian workers and families. Therefore, the second pillar involves supporting Canadians in this pandemic. The economic repercussions of COVID-19 on Canadians are substantial, already worse than those of the 2008 financial crisis.
This is not the time for austerity. Canada entered this crisis in the best fiscal positions of its peers, and the government is using that fiscal firepower on things like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and on the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, so that Canadians, businesses, and our entire economy have the support needed to weather the storm. Canadians should not have to choose between health and their job, just like Canadians should not have to take on debt that their government can better shoulder. People losing their jobs is perhaps the clearest consequence of the global economic shock that Canadians, like those in other countries, have faced. The CERB helped people stay healthy at home while being able to keep food on the table. The CEWS helped people keep their jobs or be rehired if they had been laid off. But there is still more to be done. Unemployment is in the double digits, and underemployment is high. Women, racialized Canadians, and young people have borne the brunt of job losses. Canadians need good jobs that they can rely on. To help make that happen, the government will launch a campaign to create over 1 million jobs, restoring employment to previous levels. This will be done by using a range of tools, including direct investments in the social sector and infrastructure, immediate training to quickly skill up workers, and incentives for employers to hire and retain workers. One way the government will create these jobs is by extending the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy right through the next summer. The government will work with businesses and labor to ensure the program meets the needs of the health and economic situation as it evolves. Une autre façon pour le gouvernement de créer des emplois consistera à renforcer
Another way for the
considérablement
government to
la
create jobs
stratégie emploi
would
et
involve
compétences jeunesse
considerably strengthening
plus
its
d'expérience
employment and
professionnelle
skills
rémunérée
strategy
aux jeunes Canadiens
in
lambda.
order to create
Aujourd'hui,
well-paid
plus que jamais,
jobs
les
for young
Canadiens
Canadians.
doivent
Today, more than
travailler
ever,
ensemble, notamment
Canadians
en
have to
éliminant les
work
derniers
together,
obstacles à un
especially
libre-échange complet
by
entre les
eliminating
provinces,
the last obstacles that impede full exchanges between provinces in order to relaunch the
Avec les
economy and
pertes d'emplois
Canadians
que les
back
Canadiens
on their
ont
feet.
subies, il est
With
très vite devenu évident que
the
beaucoup
efforts that
d'entre eux auraient
Canadians have
besoin
had
d'aide
to make,
jusqu'à ce qu'ils puissent retourner au
many of
travail.
them have
Mais les systèmes de soutien aux revenus
require
existants
assistance
n'ont
until they
pas
can
été
return
conçus
to
pour faire
work.
face à une
But
telle
existing
situation sans
support
précédent.
systems have not been designed.
Voilà pourquoi le gouvernement a
Unusual
rapidement
situation,
créé la
unprecedented
prestation
situation.
canadienne
That is
d'urgence,
why
un
the
programme
government
temporaire destiné à aider
quickly
des millions de
created
Canadiens
a
à
temporary
traverser une période
emergency
de
benefit program to help millions of Canadians
La
meet
relance
the
économique
exigencies of a
étant maintenant
difficult
bien
period.
engagée. Les
Since
prestataires de la PCU
the
devraient
recovery is now well
désormais
underway,
passer au régime
benefit
d'assurance emploi.
recipients will now switch
Pour
to
ceux qui
the
n'auraient pas droit
employment
à l'assurance
insurance
emploi en
program.
temps
For
normal,
those who are not
le gouvernement a
the
créé
employment
temporairement la
insurance,
prestation
the government
canadienne
has
de la relance économique.
temporarily created the
Au cours des
Canadian
prochains mois,
recovery benefit.
le
Over
régime
the coming
d'assurance
months,
emploi deviendra le seul
the
mécanisme de distribution des
insurance program will
prestations
become
d'emploi
the only mechanism to
pour les
distribute
Canadiens qui n'y avaient pas
benefits
droit avant la pandémie. Cette pandémie a montré que le
based on
Canada a besoin d'un
pre-pandemic
régime
entitlements. This
d'assurance emploi
pandemic showed
adapté
that
au
Canada
21e siècle,
requires an
y
employment
compris pour les
insurance
travailleurs
program
autonomes et les personnes qui
adapted to
travaillent
the
dans
21st century,
l'économie à la demande.
gig economy and self-employed.
Women, and in particular low-income women, have been hit hardest by COVID-19. This crisis has been described as the she session. Many women have bravely served on the front lines of this crisis in our communities and by shouldering the burden of unpaid care work at home. We must not let the legacy of this pandemic be one of rolling back the clock on women's participation in the workplace, nor one of backtracking on the social and political gain women and allies have fought so hard to secure. The government will create an action plan for women in the economy. to help more women get back into the workforce and to ensure a feminist, intersectional response to this pandemic and recovery. This plan will be guided by a task force of experts whose diverse voices will power a whole-of-government approach. It has been nearly 50 years since the Royal Commission on the Status of Women outlined the necessity of childcare services for women's social and economic equality. We have long understood that Canada cannot succeed if half the population is held back. Canadians need more accessible, affordable, inclusive, and high-quality childcare. Recognizing the urgency of this challenge, the government will make a significant, long-term, sustained investment to create a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. Le gouvernement tablera sur des investissements antérieurs.
The government
Apprendra du modèle mis en place au Québec.
will extend early investments and learn from the model in Texas so that high-quality childcare services be made accessible. All walks of life, including matters, agree to say that now is the time to act. Government to subsidize
Compte tenu de la façon dont cette pandémie a touché les parents et les familles, il est important que jamais
more important than
de
ever
possibilités de garde souple pendant l'école primaire.
Flexible childcare arrangements be made
Le gouvernement va
available.
également accélérer la mise en œuvre de la stratégie pour les femmes en entrepreneuriat,
Of
qui a déjà aidé des femmes
the women in entrepreneurship
à faire prospérer
that has already helped Canadian women to develop
tout en investissant dans les gens. Le gouvernement continuera de
while
soutenir les
investing in
entreprises qui créent des
government
emplois.
will continue to help businesses create
sont
jobs.
le moteur des communautés
Small
et
businesses
l'épine
are
dorsale de l'économie. Le gouvernement a adopté une série de mesures pour
Government has
soutenir les
adopted a
entreprises
series of
canadiennes,
measures
allant de l'aide à la masse salariale par l'intermédiaire de la
from
subvention salariale d'urgence du Canada à l'aide aux
subsidies
dépenses par le biais de prêts
to
sans intérêt.
help with via
La COVID-19 a poussé les entreprises de tout le pays, grandes comme petites,
companies
à
throughout the
repenser leur
country
façon de faire.
to rethink their business
Les
model.
entrepreneurs et les propriétaires se tournent davantage vers les
Entrepreneurs and
solutions
business
numériques,
owners are
les
looking more
solutions
and
créatives et les investissements respectueux du climat.
creative
Le gouvernement
solutions
aidera les
and
entreprises à s'adapter à l'avenir et
investments
à y
that
prospérer.
respect the climate. The government
This fall, in addition to extending the wage subsidy, the government will take further steps to bridge vulnerable businesses to the other side of the pandemic by expanding the Canada Emergency Business Account to help businesses with fixed costs, by improving the Business Credit Availability Program, and by introducing further support for industries that have been the hardest hit, including travel and tourism, and cultural industries like the performing arts. This COVID-19 emergency has had huge costs, but Canada would have been in a deeper recession and in a bigger long-term deficit if the government had done less. With interest rates so low, central banks can only do so much to help. There is a global consensus that governments must do more. Government can do so while also locking in the low cost of borrowing for decades to come. This government will preserve Canada's fiscal advantage and continue to be guided by values of sustainability and prudence. There are two distinct needs. The first is to help Canadians in the short term, to do whatever it takes, using whatever fiscal firepower is needed to support people and businesses during the pandemic. The best way to keep the economy strong is to keep Canadians healthy. The second need is to build back better with a sustainable approach for future generations. As the government builds a plan for stimulus and recovery, this must be done responsibly. In the longer term, the government will focus on targeted investments to strengthen the middle class, build resiliency, and generate growth. The government will also identify additional ways to tax extreme wealth inequality, including by concluding work to limit the stock option deduction for wealthy individuals at large, established corporations, and addressing corporate tax avoidance by digital giants. Un constat s'impose. Les géants du web empochent l'argent des Canadiens et imposent leurs propres priorités.
Are imposing
Les
their own
choses
priorities
doivent
on Canadians.
changer et elles
Things
vont changer.
must change and
Le
they will
gouvernement
change.
agira afin d'assurer
The
un
government
partage plus équitable de leurs revenus avec nos créateurs et médias.
an
En plus
edible
d'exiger
stream
qu'ils contribuent à la création, à
media
la production et à la
readers.
diffusion de nos histoires, à l'écran, en parole, en
Content
musique, par
creation
écrit.
and dissemination and
Cet automne, le
writing,
gouvernement rendra public une mise à jour du plan
audio
d'intervention
and
économique du Canada
pictures.
pour répondre
This
à la
fall, the
COVID-19.
government will publish a
Il
Canada
exposera la
digital plan.
situation économique et
It
financière
will
du
set
gouvernement,
out the
fournira
government's
des projections
financial
financières et présentera de nouvelles mesures visant à mettre en œuvre
and
le
new
présent
measures
discours du Trump.
to implement.
Cette mise à jour établira clairement
This
que la
economic
force de la
update
classe
will
moyenne
clearly establish
et le
that
bien-être
the
de tous les
strength
Canadiens
of the middle
demeurent
class
les
and the
principaux
welfare of
indicateurs
all
de réussite
Canadians
au Canada.
remain the key.
As we fight for every Canadian and defend everybody's ability to succeed, we also need to focus on the future and on building back better. This forms the third foundation of the government's approach. Around the world, advanced economies are realizing that things should not go back to business as usual. COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerabilities in our society. The government will create a resiliency agenda for the middle class and for people working hard to join it. This will include addressing the gaps in our social systems, investing in healthcare, and creating jobs. It will also include fighting climate change and maintaining a commitment to fiscal sustainability and economic growth as the foundation of a strong and vibrant society. Nous devons a priori reconnaître que l'un des plus grands drames de cette pandémie est la perte des vies humaines dans les centres de soins de longue durée. Tous les aînés méritent
The
de
loss
vivre
of
en
life in
sécurité, dans le
long-term care
respect et la
facilities.
dignité.
All of our elders
Même si les soins
deserve
de
to live
longue durée
safely
sont de
with
compétence
respect and dignity.
provinciale et
Although long-term
territoriale,
care
le
is a
gouvernement
provincial and
fédéral
territorial,
fera tout en son pouvoir
the
pour
federal
soutenir
government
les
will do
personnes
all
âgées
in its
en
power
collaboration avec les
to support
provinces et les
our
territoires.
elders in collaboration with
Le
jurisdictions.
gouvernement travaillera avec le Parlement
Government
pour apporter
will
des
work with
modifications au
Parliament
code criminel
to amend the
afin
criminal
de
code
sanctionner de
in
manière
order
claire les personnes qui
punish
négligent et
clearly
mettent en danger les
those
aînés
who
dont ils prennent
neglect
soin.
elders and put them
En
in
outre,
harm's way.
le
In addition,
gouvernement collaborera
the
avec les
government
provinces et les
will work
territoires
with provinces
en
and
vue d'établir de
territories,
nouvelles normes nationales pour les
establish
soins de longue
new
durée
national
afin que les
standards for
personnes
long-term
âgées
care
bénéficient du
so that
meilleur soutien possible.
the elderly best support
Le
possible.
gouvernement aussi
The
prendra des
government
mesures
will
supplémentaires pour
also
aider
take
les gens à
additional
vivre
measures
chez eux plus
to
longtemps.
help home.
Enfin, le gouvernement reste déterminé
Finally,
à augmenter la
the
pension de
government
la
is
sécurité de
determined
la
to
vieillesse lorsqu'une personne âgée atteint 75 ans et à augmenter la prestation de survivants du régime des pensions du Canada. Le gouvernement étudiera également d'autres mesures visant
The government will
expressément
also
les
look at
préposer
other
aux services de
measures
soutien à la personne,
in order
qui offrent un service essentiel aux gens les plus
personal
vulnérables de nos
support
communautés. Le Canada doit mieux valoriser leur travail et leur contribution à notre société.
and attribute more value
La
to their
COVID-19
contributions.
touche de façon démesurée les
COVID-19
Canadiens en situation de handicap et a mis en lumière des
They
problèmes qui
affected
durent depuis
Canadians
longtemps.
with disabilities.
Le gouvernement présentera son plan pour l'inclusion des
Has
personnes handicapées,
thrown light on their
lequel
issues.
prévoit
The Canada will
une nouvelle
present an
prestation
inclusion
canadienne pour les
plan,
personnes en
include
situation de handicap qui sera inspirée du supplément de revenus garanti destiné aux autres,
guaranteed income
une
supplement.
stratégie d'emploi robuste qui ciblera les
Robust
Canadiens en
employment
situation de
strategy
handicap
will target
et un meilleur processus pour déterminer
better
l'admissibilité
process
au
to
programme
determine
et
the
aux prestations du
admissibility to the
gouvernement qui visent les
program
personnes en
and to
situation de handicap.
government benefits.
Over the last 6 months, it has become clearer than ever, why Canadians need a resilient healthcare system. The government will ensure that everyone, including in rural and remote areas, has access to a family doctor or primary care team. COVID-19 has also shown that our system needs to be more flexible and able to reach people at home. The government will continue to expand capacity to deliver virtual healthcare. The government will also continue to address the opioid epidemic tearing through communities, which is an ongoing and worsening public health crisis. Additionally, the government will further increase access to mental health resources. All Canadians should have the care they need when they need it. We will all be stronger for it. The same goes for access to the medicine that keeps people healthy. Many Canadians who had drug plans through work lost this coverage when they were laid off because of the pandemic. So this is exactly the right moment to ramp up efforts to address that. The government remains committed to a national universal pharmacare program and will accelerate steps to achieve this system, including through a rare disease strategy to help Canadian families save money on high-cost drugs, establishing a national formulary to keep drug prices low, and working with provinces and territories willing to move forward without delay. En plus d'une bonne infrastructure de santé, les Canadiens doivent pouvoir s'épanouir dans des communautés fortes et
Canadians
sécuritaires.
must have an ability to settle in strong communities. The government intends to ban assault-style firearms and will continue to implement its commitments in respect of firearms control. In particular, provide municipalities with the ability to further restrict or ban reinforcing measures to control the influx of illegal firearms in Canada. The safety of women must be the core of any program. The government will enhance investments in transition housing and shelters and will continue the implementation of national measures against sexist violence. In order to reinforce communities further, the government will invest in all types of infrastructure over the next 2 years. It will invest in transit, environmentally friendly renovations, energy, wide broadband service in rural areas, and affordable housing especially for Aboriginal communities. For the past few months, many people have started working from home. They classes on their kitchen table, shopping online, and accessing government services remotely. It is more important than ever that all Canadians have access to internet. The government will accelerate the implementation of their connectivity and will enhance its universal broadband fund ambition so that Canadians in all regions have access to broadband. And in order to tighten the links between our communities, the government will work with partners to ensure regional schedules for airlines. It is essential that Canadians living in remote regions have access to reliable and affordable regional air service with the question of equity, employment, and economic development. The government will work to that end.
Strong communities are places where everyone has a safe, affordable home. No one should be without a place to stay during a pandemic, and for that matter, a Canadian winter. This week, the government invested more than $1 billion for people experiencing homelessness, including for this fall. In 2017, the government announced that it would reduce chronic homelessness by 50%. The government has already helped more than 1 million people get a safe and affordable place to call home. Given the progress that has been made and our commitment to do more, the government is now focused on entirely eliminating chronic homelessness in Canada. At the same time, the government will also make substantial investment in housing for Canadians. The government will add to the historic National Housing Strategy announced in 2017 by increasing investment to rapid housing in the short term and partnering with not-for-profit and co-ops in the mid to long term. For the middle class, the government will also move forward with enhancement to the first-time home buyer incentive, including in Canada's largest cities, so families can afford to buy their first home. Tout le monde mérite d'avoir un toit au-dessus de la tête.
Everyone
Et le
deserves
logement
a
est
roof
aussi un
over their
moteur
head,
essentiel de l'économie.
and housing
Les
is
projets de
a key
construction
engine
créent
of
de
the
l'emploi.
economy.
Et lorsque les gens ont un chez-soi,
Projects
ils sont
create
mieux à
employment,
même de
and
contribuer
when
à
people
leur
have a
communauté.
home,
they are better able to contribute to their community.
Tout comme chaque personne mérite un
Just
foyer,
as
chacun
everyone
mérite
deserves
de
a
pouvoir
home,
offrir des repas
everyone
nutritifs à
deserves
sa famille.
to
En raison de la pandémie,
be able for
cela a
their
été plus
family.
difficile pour les
Because of the
Canadiens.
pandemic, this has become
Le
more
gouvernement
difficult for Canadians.
continuera de
The
travailler avec des
government,
partenaires, y
working
compris
with
directement avec
partners,
les Premières Nations,
including
les Inuits
directly with
et les
First
Métis,
Nations,
pour
Inuit, and
combattre l'insécurité alimentaire au Canada.
at food insecurity
Le
in Canada.
gouvernement renforcera aussi
The
les chaînes
government will
d'approvisionnement
also
alimentaire
reinforce
locales du pays.
local food supply chains.
Les travailleurs canadiens et migrants qui produisent, récoltent et transforment les
Migrant
aliments,
workers
des
who
cueilleurs de fruits jusqu'aux
take,
gens qui emballent les
process
fruits mer,
our
ont fait un
crops
travail
from
remarquable
fruit
pour mettre de la
pickers,
bonne nourriture dans l'assiette
seafood
des gens.
processors have made a
Ils
remarkable
méritent tout le
job
soutien et la
in
protection
putting
du
food on people.
Le gouvernement verra également ce que
The
les
government will
travailleurs des
also
secteurs
ensure
soumis à la gestion
that
de l'offre au
workers
Canada
in
reçoivent un
time
dédommagement
management
plein
sector
et équitable
receive
par suite
equitable
des accords commerciaux
compensation.
conclus récemment. Nos familles peuvent se nourrir grâce aux agriculteurs.
Our
Et nous
families
allons continuer de les aider à
are fed
réussir
thanks
et à
to
faire
our
croître
farm
leur
workers, and we will continue to help.
Cette pandémie a
This
révélé des
pandemic
lacunes dans les secteurs de la
has
santé,
revealed
du
gaps
logement
in our
et de
health
l'approvisionnement
systems,
alimentaire.
our housing,
Elle a aussi
and our
mis en
food
lumière
supply.
les inégalités
It has
auxquelles les
also
Canadiens font face
highlighted
sur le marché du
inequalities
travail.
that Canadians face on the labor market.
Nous avons l'occasion de non seulement soutenir les Canadiens,
Opportunity not only
mais
to
aussi
support
d'accroître
Canadians,
leur potentiel.
but also to
En collaboration
potential.
avec les provinces et les
In
territoires,
collaboration with
le
provinces and
gouvernement fera les
territories,
plus grands
the government
investissements de l'histoire
will
canadienne
invest
en formation de
significantly,
travailleurs.
more than ever,
Cet investissement a pour objectif
train workers.
de
This
soutenir les
investment
Canadiens qui
aims to
acquièrent
support
de nouvelles compétences dans
Canadians
des
who
secteurs
acquire
de
new
croissance,
skills, growth
d'aider
sectors,
les travailleurs à
to
suivre
help
des formations et à
workers
obtenir des
receive
accréditations
training and obtain
et de
accreditation,
renforcer les travailleurs
and
futurs
to
en les mettant en
reinforce
contact avec des
future
employeurs
workers
et de
by
bons emplois
placing
dans l'objectif de
good
faire
employers
croître
and
et
good
de
jobs
renforcer la
in
classe
order
moyenne.
to help the growth.
From researchers developing vaccines to entrepreneurs building online stores, this pandemic has reminded us of the power of the knowledge economy and how vital it is for our future. Canadians are leading, and they should have government services that keep up. The government will make generational investments in updating outdated IT systems to modernize the way that government serves Canadians, from the elderly to the young, from people looking for work to those living with a disability. The government will also work to introduce free, automatic tax filing for simple returns to ensure citizens receive the benefits they need. Government must remain agile and ready for what lies ahead. Climate action will be a cornerstone of our plan to support and create 1 million jobs across the country. This is where the world is going. Global consumers and investors are demanding and rewarding climate action. Canadians have the determination and ingenuity to rise to this challenge and global market opportunity. We can create good jobs today and a globally competitive economy, not just next year, but in 2030, 2040, and beyond. Les Canadiens sont conscients que les changements
Canadians
climatiques
are
menacent
aware
leur
that
santé, leur
climate
mode de
change
vie,
threatens their health, their
Ils veulent une
lifestyle,
action
and their
climatique dès
planet.
maintenant.
They want
Et c'est ce
climate
que le
change
gouvernement
and climate
continuera de
action
faire.
now, and that was the government will continue to provide.
Le gouvernement mettra immédiatement en
Government
place
will
un plan qui
immediately
permettra de
implement a
surpasser les
plan
objectifs climatiques du Canada
to
pour 2030.
overshoot
Le
Canada's climate
gouvernement
objectives for
légiférera
2030.
également
The
sur
government will
l'objectif
also
canadien de
legislate
zéro
on
émission
Canadians'
nette
goal
d'ici 2050. Dans le
50.
cadre de son plan, le
As part
Canada
of its
prévoit les mesures
plan,
suivantes.
Canada and
Créer des milliers
following
d'emplois dans
measures,
la rénovation de
creating
maisons et
thousands of
d'immeubles,
jobs
ce qui
in
permettra de réduire la facture énergétique des familles et des entreprises canadiennes. Investir dans la réduction des effets des catastrophes climatiques, comme les
energy
inondations
bills,
et les feux de forêt,
fight
pour rendre les communautés
for
plus
catastrophes
sûres et
such as
résilientes.
floods and forest fires in order to make
Favoriser la mise en place d'un des plus
resilient.
grands nombres de solutions de
Promote
transport en commun
the
et de
implementation
transport
of
actif.
more
Rendre les véhicules zéro émission plus abordables et plus
or
accessibles.
that zero
Et
emission
investir
vehicles
dans
are more
l'élargissement de l'infrastructure de recharge à
best
l'échelle du
in the
Un bon exemple d'adaptation
of the
vers un
country.
avenir neutre en
A
carbone
good
réside dans la
example
construction de
of
véhicules et de batteries
working to
zéro émission.
of zero-emission batteries. Nickel, copper, Canada has the resources necessary for this clean future. Together with Canada's technology, they are a competitive advantage for our country. The government will undertake a new fund in order to attract investments in the manufacturing of zero-emission products and will reduce by half the innovation rate for those companies in order to create jobs and to make Canada a world leader in clean technology. The government will seek to make Canada the most competitive destination in the world for clean. The government will also take measures that we fuel our economy and our communities by going forward with clean energy funds, especially projects such as the Atlantic Loop that will provide energy supplies to companies that abandon coal, and supporting investment in renewable energies and clean energy solutions and technology for the next generation.
Canada cannot reach net zero without the know-how of the energy sector and the innovative ideas of all Canadians, including people in places like British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and Labrador. The government will support manufacturing, natural resource, and energy sectors as they work to transform to meet a net zero future, creating good-paying and long-lasting jobs. And it will recognize farmers, foresters, and ranchers as key partners in the fight against climate change, supporting their efforts to reduce emissions and to build resilience. The government will continue its policy of putting a price on pollution while putting that money back in the pockets of Canadians. It cannot be free to pollute. This pandemic has reminded Canadians of the importance of nature. The government will work with municipalities as part of a new commitment to expand urban parks so that everyone has access to green space. This will be done while protecting a quarter of Canada's land and a quarter of Canada's oceans in 5 years, and using nature-based solutions to fight climate change, including by planting 2 billion trees. The government will ban harmful single-use plastics next year and ensure more plastic is recycled. And the government will also modernize Canada's Environmental Protection Act. When the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration was closed by a previous government, Canada lost an important tool to manage its waters. The government will create a new Canada Water Agency to keep our water safe, clean, and well managed. The government will also identify opportunities to build more resilient water and irrigation infrastructure. At the same time, the government will look at continuing to grow Canada's ocean economy to create opportunities for fishers and coastal communities, while advancing reconciliation and conservation objectives. Investing in the blue economy will help Canada prosper.
We are waging this fight for today's Canadians and for the Canada of tomorrow. We must therefore never forget the values that define us, and this is the fourth and final pillar of the government's approach, defending Canada's value, that all can benefit from them. In Canada, we take care of each other. That is what has helped our country deal the pandemic better than many others. Canada must continue to defend the values that define it, whether it be welcoming
ou de célébrer ces 2 langues officielles. Il reste encore du travail à faire, notamment sur le chemin de la réconciliation,
much more work
dans la
to be
lutte contre le racisme
path of
systémique.
reconciliation and in the path.
Tout au long de la pandémie, le gouvernement
Throughout
s'est
the
fixé
pandemic,
comme priorité
the
de
government
soutenir les
has
communautés
set
autochtones,
itself the
ce
objective
qui a
of
permis de
supporting
contenir la propagation de la COVID-19 et de
help
garantir
to
la sécurité
contain
des gens.
the spread of
Le
COVID-19
gouvernement
and to guarantee
poursuivra
people's
ses efforts en ce sens.
government will continue its efforts to that end.
The government will walk the shared path of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and remain focused on implementing the commitments made in 2019. However, the pandemic has shown that we need to keep moving forward even faster on a number of fronts including by expediting work to co-develop distinction-based Indigenous health legislation with First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation, and a distinction-based mental health and wellness strategy. By accelerating work on the National Action Plan in response to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, calls for justice, as well as implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And by continuing to close the infrastructure gap in Indigenous community, working on a distinction basis with First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation to accelerate the government's 10-year commitment. The government will also make additional resiliency investment to meet the clean drinking water commitment in First Nations community and support additional capacity building for First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation. The government will also move forward to introduce legislation to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples before the end of this year. Pour trop de Canadiens, le racisme systémique est
Many
une
Canadians,
réalité bien présente.
too many Canadians, systemic
Nous savons que le
racism
racisme n'a
is
pas
an
pris de pause
reality.
pendant la pandémie.
We know that racism did not take a break during the pandemic. To the contrary, COVID-19 struck disproportionately racialized Canadians. Many people, including Indigenous, Black, and racialized Canadians, have asked loud and clear for change. They tell us that we must do more. The government agrees. The government has promised to attack systemic racism based on the lived experiences of racialized.
The government has invested in economic empowerment through the Black Entrepreneurship Program, while working to close the gaps in services for Indigenous communities. Important steps were taken with the release of Canada's anti-racism strategy for 2019 to 2022, the creation of an anti-racism secretariat, and the appointment of the first ever minister focused specifically on diversity and inclusion. This is all good, but much more needs to be done for permanent, transformative change to take place. The government will redouble its effort by taking action on online hate, going further on economic empowerment for specific communities, and increasing diversity on procurement, building a whole-of-federal government approach around better collection of disaggregated data, implementing an action plan to increase representation in hiring and appointments, and leadership development within the public service, and by taking new steps to support the artistic and economic contributions of Black Canadian culture and heritage. Progress must also be made through the policing and justice systems. All Canadians must have the confidence that the justice system is there to protect them, not to harm them. Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. That has to change. The government will take steps to ensure that a strong hand of criminal justice is used where it is needed to keep people safe, but not where it would be discriminatory or counterproductive. The government will introduce legislation and make investments that take action to address the systemic inequities in all phases of the criminal justice system, from diversion to sentencing, from rehabilitation to records. The government will move forward on enhanced civilian oversight of our law enforcement agencies, including the RCMP. It will modernize training for police and law enforcement, including addressing standards around the use of force. It will move forward on RCMP reforms with a shift toward community-led policing. And it will accelerate work to co-develop a legislative framework for First Nations policing as an essential service. Nos deux langues officielles sont
Our two official languages are an indispensable part of our country's heritage. Defending the rights of Francophone minorities outside Quebec and the Anglophone minority in Quebec are a priority for the government. But the Government of Canada must also recognize the French as being particular. There are almost 8 million Francophones in Canada in an ocean of almost. The government has a responsibility to protect and promote French, not merely outside Quebec, but also. To that end, 51 years. The government is undertaking to reinforce the law by taking in French.
Immigration remains a driver of Canada's economic growth. With other countries rejecting global talent that could help their economy, Canada has an opportunity, as we recover, to become the world's top destination for talent, capital, and jobs. When people choose Canada, help build Canada, and make sacrifices in support of Canada, we should make it easier for them to formally become Canadians. Earlier this year, the government announced measures to grant permanent residency to people who, although not Canadian citizens, had cared for the most vulnerable in long-term care homes and other medical facilities. The government will continue to bring in newcomers and support family reunification. We know that there is an economic and human advantage to having families together. As part of both the short-term economic recovery and of a long-term plan for growth, the government will leverage the advantage we have on immigration to keep Canada competitive on the world stage. Nous devons donner suite à toutes ces priorités au pays.
Implement all those priorities for the country, but we must also live in. COVID-19 has accelerated the fragmented world order. It remains in Canada's interests to forge bilateral and multilateral relationships. Charity. The government will invest more in international development and will help developing countries. Resilience. Canada will also. Our world to a vaccine. We cannot eliminate this pandemic in Canada if we cannot eliminate it everywhere in the world.
The government will also continue to stand up for human rights and the rule of law. It is unacceptable that any citizen be arbitrarily detained. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor must be brought home. This is something for which all Canadians stand united. The government will continue to fight for free trade, including by leading the Ottawa Group to reform the World Trade Organization. Our like-minded allies and partners are investing to make sure their societies emerge stronger. This government's plan does that as well. Taken together, this is an ambitious plan for an unprecedented reality. The course of events will determine what needs to be done when. But throughout, protecting and supporting Canadians will stay the top priority. And the core values that have driven the government since day one will remain the same. In 2015, Canadians asked their government to deliver real change on everything from middle-class jobs to climate change. In 2019, the people chose a parliament that would keep moving forward on these shared goals. And in 2020, Canadians expect nothing less. It is no small task to build a stronger, more resilient country. It will take hard work. It will require a commitment to finding common ground. Mesdames et messieurs, les parlementaires,
ladies and gentlemen, parliamentarians, Canadians count on you to keep moving this country forward. I expect you to work together to meet the challenges that confront us. Remember that we are here today thanks to the generations of Canadians that preceded us. We are here today thanks to the men and women, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents,
who had the courage to aspire to a better future. Today, it's our turn. We have a chance to build a stronger and more resilient Canada for all. Ladies and gentlemen, you will be called upon to vote the necessary supply to finance. Senators and members of Parliament, may you be worthy of the confidence vested in you by Canadians, and may Providence guide you in the exercise of your functions.
There you have it, the speech from the throne for 2020, laying out the government's priorities. The government promising 1 million jobs, extending the wage subsidy program for companies to summer 2021, revealing they will be putting everyone on EI who has lost their jobs, including those who did not qualify before. That will be the sole delivery system. Discussions of a national child care program, national pharmacare program, funding for long-term care homes, and an introduction of new criminal code measures to help protect seniors from neglect. Also promises about housing, allowing cities to ban guns, and climate change. The government saying they will accelerate and double down on their 2030 Paris Climate Accord promises. Also looking to help racialized and Indigenous Canadians, oversight of the police, changes to the laws, all kinds of things happening here. Standing by with his reaction is leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh. Jagmeet Singh, the government's fate likely rests in your hands. Did you hear enough in this speech that you're willing to vote to keep this government in power?
Well, Ms. Stevenson, what I've said in the past is that I wouldn't be surprised if the Liberal government and Prime Minister Trudeau said a lot of the right things. They've been really good at saying the right words, but not so good at actually delivering the action or making people's lives better. And so where we hear the Liberal government announcing a lot of the promises and commitments, we haven't seen action in the past. The pharmacare announcement, well, they've promised pharmacare since the late 90s and has not been achieved. People are not better off. They talk about housing. When we look at the existing housing announcement that they made, they've not spent money in many provinces. People have not seen a dime or no investments, no building of new affordable housing. So what I'm worried about, again, is this is a nice speech, a lot of maybe nice words, but they don't match up with this Liberal government's actions, particularly given that their first action they're taking right now is a proposal to cut the help that Canadians receive who cannot go back to work. That to me is wrong. So I've said very clearly to the Prime Minister, if the Prime Minister wants our support, then if they put in place a commitment to not cut help to Canadians who can't go to work, keep their supports at the same level, and put in place paid sick leave, we will support that legislation.
Mr. Singh, when you say cut the help to Canadians, is that your reference to them winding down the CERB and putting everybody onto employment insurance instead?
Right, and I'm not worried about the mechanism. Rolling things to EI is not my concern. My concern is the fact that the Liberal government's proposing to cut the help that families receive by 20%, taking it from $2,000 down to $1,600. That massive cut to help to Canadians who are not able to work through no fault of their own. These are folks that have jobs that are not there anymore. They have a sector that they can no longer go back to because of COVID-19 restrictions. Tourism, hospitality, service sector. So for those workers, the Liberal government's first actual act, the proposal on the table right now, the one that we have and that we received since the summer, is to cut their help. That's wrong. They should take that back and instead maintain the same level of support and put in place paid sick leave, and that's something that we could support.
So then I guess I'll circle back to that sort of original question. Are you willing to vote in favor of what's in the throne speech and then wait and see whether you want to continue to support the government on the budget, or is this insufficient and you're prepared to head to an election?
What I've said from the beginning, Ms. Stevenson, is that I'm not looking for a way to tear down government. I want to continue to fight for people. That's what we've been doing as New Democrats from the beginning, helping to make sure that those who are being forgotten about or left behind are not forgotten about, and fighting for the people that need help. So right now, our test to the Liberal government is this. You're saying a lot of words, but what are your actions? Well, the first act that they proposed is to cut the help to people. They've got to stop that. They've got to stop their proposal to cut help to Canadians, and instead, in a second wave with numbers increasing, we need to see the same level of support to families that can't go back to work, and we need to see paid sick leave. And I'll wait to see the government's response to that. But that action would show me a commitment to actually helping people more than the words on the paper of the throne speech.
Well, we're keeping a close eye on that to see if you get what you're asking for there. Mr. Singh, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Ms. Stevenson.
Meanwhile, here in Ottawa and around the country, we have our panel of strategists to discuss this. I'm going to start with Greg McEachran. Greg, I didn't think that there was a lot of really big surprises in this speech. It seemed like maybe the Liberals didn't go as far as they had initially wanted to. A lot of things here that are going to play pretty well with large segments of the Canadian population. What are your thoughts?
Well, in terms of my expectations, what we discussed prior to the speech, I do see a lot in terms of the health and safety of Canadians and building the economy back. To make it a bit more personal, I just received an email from a friend of mine who said, as a working mother, it felt really personal and something that she was very happy to see, that what the impact of the pandemic has been on working mothers over the last 6 months. The speech refers to how it's the C-session. In the mid-90s, I remember Newsweek magazine had a cover story where they called it the mummy track, that when women were getting their kids out the door, they were having their elderly parents come in. And nothing has really changed around that. We had the pandemic bring that so clearly home, where we have parents right now concerned about daycares and schools, and we also have people concerned about their parents in elderly care. So the speech did refer to those, but I guess it also does speak to certain segments of the population incredibly strongly. So no matter what I'm prepared to say as someone who supports the Liberal Party, I remember what my mother experienced in the mid-90s. I know what my friends are going through right now with elderly parents and who have, I have a sibling and a sister-in-law that are teachers with kids who are dealing with it on both sides. So I think one of the biggest things we need to remember is that this speech was designed not just to speak to those 338 people that have been elected to represent us, but Canadians as a whole. And it needs to be a document, a device that can kind of go over their heads and grab the attention of Canadians, so that this government says to Canadians, yes, we are on this, we're working for this. I think it did that. Again, I am a bit affected by the email that I just saw. Again, that's not something that I'm going to personally experience, but someone's first reaction was to say, I was almost in tears that I finally feel seen for what I've experienced for the last 6 months.
Melissa, one of the big things in here, a promise to create 1 million jobs, both through green programs, things like retrofits, but also the extension of that wage subsidy program. It had been winding down. The government has now reversed themselves. They're going to bring this through to summer of 2021, so almost a year from now that this will keep going. What are your thoughts on that promise and on the throne speech overall?
I think the businesses across the country have probably felt heard with that request, particularly because the uptake on it from the very beginning wasn't as great as the government had intended for it. So you probably see more uptake to the end of the year. But in general, on the speech, they really set the expectation very high today, that they would do something that was grand, that was novel, that was a reason to shut down Parliament, shut down the investigations, shut down the committees, to set the country in a new direction. And instead, I think you saw a speech that is frankly a continuation of what the government is already doing. Much of the same platitudes, the repetition of campaign promises in the past. The word continue appears, 23 times. So I'm not sure that this is This is the thing that we've been waiting for in terms of a direction where people feel comfortable about their immediate futures. And maybe that's just a setup for tonight at 6:30 when the Prime Minister addresses the nation. Maybe there's actually more here.
Yeah, we're very curious to see what he has to say. We're almost out of time, but Kiavash, I want to give the final word to you. You just heard from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. What's your take on how the NDP is going to handle this, since that's probably who will decide whether we go to an election or not?
Yeah, to echo what Melissa said, there was a lot of hype around this speech, and the speech did not live up to that hype. That said, there are some positive areas where I think really opens up the space for the New Democrats to try to build on. On a number of fronts, the government has opened conversations on issues that are important to New Democrats and their agenda for making life better for Canadians. One thing that is missing from this speech is what Jagmeet Singh just pointed out. 3 million people are going to be worse off at the end of this week because of CERB winding down. So like seeing either an extension to CERB or a commitment that this change to EI is going to be, a more sustainable and permanent situation, and that it would be equal to what CERB has been, that's going to be really important. We didn't see it in this speech. Maybe tonight at 6:30, there's some surprise there.
I can do a super quick round robin. Yes or no, starting with Greg, do you think we're heading into an election?
No.
No? Melissa?
Absolutely not.
Oh, Kiavash?
Not at all.
There we Well, they agree on one thing, no election ahead. We'll certainly be keeping an eye on that and on the continued fallout from this throne speech. Thank you so much to our panel for joining us, and we'll of course be keeping a close eye on all of this for you. The Liberal government having just determined and unveiled their plan for this fall, including extending the wage subsidy, bringing in national child care, pharmacare, changes to the criminal code to protect elders, and as well as measures to protect racialized Canadians and get them to participate in the economy. A lot still to dig through. We'll be hearing more from the Prime Minister tonight, and we will, of course, be bringing that to you live. So it doesn't end here. Prime Minister Trudeau set to address the nation beginning tonight at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. Donna Friesen will be bringing you that. Our network coverage, which you can catch on Global News streaming service, on our online portals, and across the Global News main network. For those of you staying on our streaming service, your national and international headlines are just ahead. But for the rest, we leave you now with some sights and sounds of today's speech from the throne. Thanks for joining us.
Personnel de la santé et aux travailleurs essentiels, aux femmes, et to create a stronger, more resilient Canada. And what will see us